Chapter 211, Food Delivery 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. A day after the Mid-Autumn Festival, Jing'an, He Changqi, invited his friends to a small gathering at their estate. Keeping to the promise she had made earlier with matriarch He and eldest brother-in-law, when it was close to noon, Chu Lian guided her maidservants as they worked together to prepare a few special dishes to be sent to the outer court later. However, Chu Lian was He Changdi's wife after all. It wouldn't be very appropriate if she and her maidservants brought the dishes to the outer court just like that. She thought for a moment and decided that it would be better to go over to Qingxi Hall first and let matriarch He's servants send the dishes instead. When they arrived at the entrance of Qingxi Hall, they could hear the sounds of conversation from inside. Matriarch He's handmaid, Mu Xiang, happened to be on her way out at this time and spotted Chu Lian at the entrance. She smiled and greeted her. "Third young madam, you've come over. Please come in. Eldest young madam and the two young ladies are already inside." After she said so, she lifted the bamboo blinds covering the entrance for Chu Lian and took over the big box of food from Mingyan's hands. Next, she followed behind Chu Lian as she walked into the parlor of Qingxi Hall. Matriarch He was seated in the highest-ranked seat. She didn't know what Matriarch He and Madame Zhou were talking about, but they were laughing together and obviously in a very good mood. Chu Lian's gaze shot over to Madame Zhou. She noticed that Madame Zhou was wearing a navy blue dress made in the latest style, with a sheer smoky blue outer garment. The ornament on her head was the sapphire headdress bestowed by the Empress Dowager at the Mid-Autumn Banquet. Although she was dressed elegantly, it was a pity that this headdress looked very old-fashioned and added several years to her age. Madame Zhou was only in her mid-20s, but looked to be in her mid-30s instead with this headdress. Madame Zhou was all smiles. Whatever she had said before seemed to have amused Matriarch He. "Greetings to grandmother and eldest sister-in-law." Chu Lian bobbed towards the both of them. "Sanlang's wife, you've arrived. Come and sit down. Your eldest brother-in-law just sent someone over from the outer court to inquire about the food." Madame Zhou cast a glance over and found that Chu Lian was still dressed in plain home clothes. Her black hair was fixed into a bun with just a single green jade hairpin, and she wasn't wearing any other jewelry on her body. Only then did Madame Zhou heave a sigh of relief in her heart. It seemed that Chu Lian wasn't intending to go to the outer court, dressed like this. Chu Lian gave a slight smile. One of the dishes had to be stewed for a longer period of time, so granddaughter-in-law was delayed for a bit. "Grandmother, eldest sister-in-law, please forgive granddaughter-in-law for being late." Matriarch He pulled Chu Lian to her side. If she didn't have to worry about Dalong's wife being there, Matriarch He would definitely have pinched Chu Lian's tiny nose. "Silly child, how could grandmother blame you? Senior servant Liu, take these food boxes to the outer court." Right after Matriarch He finished speaking, Madame Zhou quickly spoke up. "Grandmother, since they're Dalong's close friends, there's no need to trouble senior servant Liu. It would be better for granddaughter-in-law to send it over personally." Matriarch He casually glanced at Madame Zhou's dressed-up appearance. She paused for a moment before nodding. "Why don't you lead the servants and send it over then? Just be careful on the way there. Don't let Dalong lose face in front of his friends." Seeing that Matriarch He had agreed, Madame Zhou heaved a sigh of relief and quickly assured her, "Please don't worry, grandmother. Granddaughter-in-law knows how to behave appropriately." Madame Zhou then bowed respectfully towards Matriarch He before she led her servants away with the food boxes and hurried to the outer court. It wasn't until Madame Zhou's figure had passed through the entrance of the parlor that Chu Lian said with a smile, "Grandmother, I boiled an entire pot of old duck soup just now. I made sure that the meat is soft enough to come right off the bone. It's perfect for you to eat. Today, granddaughter-in-law offers up this dish and will trade it for a free meal here with you. Does grandmother have a seat at the table for me?" Pfft. Matriarch He laughed. "There's no need to act like that, silly child. You can just say it out directly if you want to have a meal with grandmother." Matriarch He got busy with instructing Mu Xiang to have the other maidservants serve up the meal. Chu Lian ate lunch together with Matriarch He in Qingxi Hall. She waited upon Matriarch He until the matriarch took her afternoon nap before returning to her own Songtao court. Chapter 212, Food Delivery 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. The sun was shining brightly in the sky today, making it somewhat hot and stuffy. There was a small garden next to Songtao Court filled with blooming chrysanthemum flowers, and within the cluster of chrysanthemums, there was a decorative mountain with an interesting shape. A small stream flowed continuously into a lotus pond beside the decorative mountain. Unfortunately, the lotus leaves and flowers in the pond had already withered away by this time. However, you could admire the view of the autumn chrysanthemums alongside the glimmering pond from the pavilion. The chrysanthemums adjacent to the decorative mountain made for a very beautiful scene. There was a zither room located next to this pavilion. Since it was close to Songtao Court, Chu Lian went there frequently in the afternoon to enjoy the cool weather. While returning to Songtao Court, Chu Lian happened to pass by the little zither room. She glanced at it and then told Ming Yin behind her, "It's a little hot today. Get someone to move a lounge chair over there. I'll have a nap over in that zither room." In the outer court of the Jing'an estate, a group of young men were seated at the main table in the hall. All of them were good friends of He Changqi who had been invited to the small gathering. Standing amongst them was the newly appointed young official of the Honglu Temple, Lord Gu. There was also Marquis Wei Yuan, who had inherited his title not long ago from his predecessor, Madame Zhou's brother, Zhou Wu, from the second branch of House Dingyuan and House Zheng's young heir, Zheng Tianqing. There was a tall young man in a green robe right next to him. It was none other than Xiao Bojian from the Imperial College. Xiao Bojian and He Changqi weren't actually friends or even acquaintances. He had been invited to the Jing'an estate thanks to his connection to Heir Zheng. Everyone present here knew that Heir Zheng had a best friend who was a senior brother one grade above him at the Imperial College. Xiao Bojian's looks were a perfect match to the aesthetic taste of the people of this era. Furthermore, he had a natural gentlemanly aura and carried himself with elegance. This meant that it was rare for anyone not to have a good impression of him. Thus, Xiao Bojian had always been like a fish in water when interacting in society. People made friends with him most likely due to his good appearance and temperament while ignoring his humble background. Lord Gu sipped at his cup of sencha and smiled. "Brother He, surely you're not trying to play a trick on us? It's going to be noon in the blink of an eye, but you haven't ordered your servants to start serving the meal. Are you trying to let your brothers starve to death?" A trace of awkwardness appeared on He Changqi's face after he heard those words. A few days ago, he had boasted in front of his friends that he would be treating them to delicacies that they had never seen before. He even used the longevity peach buns from House Dingyuan's longevity feast to tempt his group of brothers, making them crave for the food they hadn't even seen yet. However, nothing had been served up till now, so even he was starving a little. "Brothers, please stay calm. Since these are delicacies we're talking about, it will definitely be worth the wait for us." Xiao Bojian displayed a gentle smile, and everyone nodded in agreement. He Changqi had mentioned in advance to everyone gathered today that the entire meal would be personally prepared by the third young madam of House Jing'an, the Emperor's newly conferred honored Lady Jianni. It could be considered an honor to be able to eat the food personally made by an honored lady. At last, He Changqi's manservant came over in a hurry and whispered something into his ear. He Changqi lit up in delight upon hearing this. "Brothers, it seems like our wait has finally paid off." As expected, in a moment, the luxuriously dressed Madame Zhou entered the parlor, leading a maidservant with a huge food box and directing her to the dining table in the hall. He Changqi's friends had also gotten up to give Madame Zhou a respectful bow. Apart from Madame Zhou's older brother, each of them greeted her with a call of sister-in-law. Amongst these people, He Changqi was the oldest, so there was nothing wrong with how they had addressed her. Madame Zhou rarely had the opportunity to meet with He Changqi's good friends. Now that her husband had finally brought his friends over for a small gathering, she had to meet them and give them a good impression of her. However, she had dressed a little excessively today. A small gathering between close friends was supposed to be relaxed and comfortable, but she had inadvertently made the atmosphere a little stiff dressed like that. When Xiao Bojian lowered his head in a slight bow, his eyes were filled with disdain. Chapter 213. Lies 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Changqi's group of friends couldn't be bothered with judging Madame Zhou once the handmaid started bringing out dish after dish from the huge container. The first dish was a whole row of sweet and sour pork ribs covered in a thick sauce served on a delicate porcelain plate. The second dish was served in a clay pot. When the lid was lifted, the fragrant aroma of the braised duck within drifted out. Next, there was a huge serving of poached fish slices that looked as soft and tender as tofu, covered in a layer of red-hot chilis. Right after that, it was a plate of sautéed shredded pork and sweet bean sauce, decorated with thinly sliced spring onion. Then a large bowl of steaming hot tofu soup. As each dish was placed on the table, the eyes of the gentleman seated at the table widened more and more. Finally, the handmaid brought out a small pan and stove and placed it in the center of the table. When she carefully lit up the stove, the gentlemen all wore expressions of astonishment. Zheng had never seen such a method of eating before. Furthermore, he had never seen nor eaten anything like all the delicious and fragrant dishes placed on the table before. He pointed excitedly at the lit stove in the center. "Sister-in-law, what's that called? I've never seen a dish like this before, even when I visited the palace." Seated at the host's place at the table, Changqi was clearly more than satisfied with the dishes that Chu Lian had cooked for them today. Other than the poached fish slices that he had eaten before, he hadn't even seen or heard of the other delicacies placed before him now. Since Madame Zhou was to present the dishes in place of Chu Lian had already told her all about the dishes and their names. By this time, all the hungry men had turned to look up at her with expectation. Having those eyes fixed upon her gave Madame Zhou the long-awaited satisfaction of having all attention drawn to her. That satisfaction also gave her courage, the courage to follow through with a thought she had been harboring for some time. She smiled elegantly, showing off the aura of a model noble lady. Thus, Changqi's friends heard her speak in a lovely, womanly voice. "Gentlemen, the one in the center is called a dry steamboat. This method of eating is very simple. You just have to prepare all the ingredients for cooking beforehand and place it in the pan. When you want to eat, all you have to do is light the fire under this pan. It's very convenient." Zheng loved novel things, so he leaned forward to take a closer look before applauding and giving praise. "Wonderful, wonderful. This is just too wonderful. With this, no matter when you're hungry, you'll be able to eat some freshly cooked food. What a great idea." The other men gave their agreement. When Madame Zhou heard Zheng's praise, she was even happier. The corners of her lips lifted up as she couldn't hold back the excitement in her heart. "Indeed, I just so happened to discover this method of eating one day. I didn't think that Zheng would like it this much." The joy on the men's faces faded away, and they all stiffened. Changqi was flooded with embarrassment. He wanted to tug at his wife's sleeve to stop her, but Madame Zhou was already carrying on with her explanation. "These here are poached fish slices. The red pieces floating on top are a new type of vegetable that Dalong bought over from some outsiders. I thought these looked strange and new, so I tried using them in my cooking. Who could have expected that these would enhance the flavor of these poached fish slices so much? You'll have to try it for yourself later. As for that dish over there," Madame Zhou jabbered on by herself and introduced all the dishes on the table. However, she didn't realize that the expressions of the men at the table had already changed and become a little unusual. Xiao Bojian's slanted eyes were full of disdain. He looked at Madame Zhou with contempt. This woman had just tried to claim Lianer's credit for herself. Wasn't she even the slightest bit ashamed that she was speaking such blatant lies right in front of them? Changqi's face was already flushed red from his suppressed emotions. However, he just didn't have the heart to expose his wife upon seeing her so animated. It wasn't until Madame Zhou had finished introducing every single dish that she realized that her surroundings had fallen silent. The air around them wasn't as lively as it had been when the dishes had been brought out. She looked around, feeling a little lost, as her heart leapt into her throat. She tried asking lightly, "What's wrong? Do you not like the dishes that sister-in-law has prepared?" The young Marquis Weiyuan and Honglu Temple's Lord Gu both exchanged looks and had a tacit understanding. Marquis Weiyuan smiled and bowed towards Madame Zhou. "Sister-in-law, you're thinking too much. It's our fortune to be able to taste sister-in-law's cooking for ourselves." After hearing Marquis Weiyuan's words, Madame Zhou's heart settled down. She was about to speak further when Changqi quickly cut in. All right, enough. I'm going to chat with my good friends here. Why don't you return first? Madame Zhou could only keep her silence. It was a rare occasion for her husband to bring his friends over after all. Furthermore, they were all men. It wasn't very appropriate for her to stay in this gathering as a lady of the inner court. Thus, she bid her farewells to them and left with a distinguished and elegant air, accompanied by her maidservants. TL note, here comes the feast. Sweet and sour pork ribs, old duck soup, poached fish slices with chili, sautéed shredded pork and sweet bean sauce, tofu soup, dry steamboat. Chapter 214. Lies 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. It wasn't long after Madame Zhou's figure had disappeared from their sights that Changqi stood up and bowed deeply to his friends with his fists cupped together. My humble wife wasn't honest. I would like to ask for your forgiveness and hope that you won't hold it against her for this dishonesty. Madame Zhou didn't know that Changqi had already told his friends about Chu Lian's cooking. However, Madame Zhou had suddenly tried to steal Chu Lian's credit in front of Changqi and his friends. Her plan had failed, and she had shown that she didn't have the virtues that a good wife should have. Not only that, she had practically slapped Changqi in the face in front of his good friends. Lord Gu quickly helped Changqi back up. Brother He, please don't blame yourself. Everyone has some form of greed for fortune and fame. Sister-in-law simply wanted to impress us brothers for your sake. There's no reason for us to blame her. Marquis Weiyuan smiled and agreed with Lord Ji's sentiment. It's rare for us all to have the time to meet. There's a great feast before us, so let's not waste it. Come, let's eat and drink. After this whole turn of events, Madame Zhou's lies had already been exposed. Although Changqi's friends let it pass so as to help Changqi keep his dignity, the same couldn't be said for their private thoughts. However, there was one point of similarity. Madame Zhou's image had been utterly destroyed in front of them. Even Zheng and Marquis Weiyuan were starting to pity Changqi. Without speaking of how Madame Zhou hadn't given Changqi a male heir yet, just based on what they had seen of her personality today, it had completely changed how these few men thought of the ladies of the Dingyuan estate. Changqi had been expecting to impress his friends today. However, after Madame Zhou's little play, Changqi was so ashamed that he couldn't hold his head high amongst his friends. Luckily, the awkward atmosphere didn't last for long. When the men started tasting the food before them, they completely forgot about Madame Zhou and her lies. All that remained in their minds was the delicious food on the table. Right here and right now, they couldn't let these delicacies go to waste. There was usually a refined and lofty air at these friendly meetings between noblemen. They would brew some tea, warm up some wine, and maybe grill some venison with their good friends. If the mood was right, they might even compose a few poems, or couplets with brushes in hand and wine cups in the other. Basically, it would be very elegant and dignified. Wolfing down their food and searching for seconds in the pot was something that unrefined barbarians would do. It was something that these noble and high-born gentlemen would never do. However, nobility, manners, elegance, are those edible? Could those silly principles satisfy the hunger in their bellies? Of course not. Marquis Weiyuan and Lord Gu were childhood friends and had grown up together. When they had started studying, they had studied together in the Gu family's private school for their own clan members. Their mothers were best friends, so the two kids had practically grown up wearing the same pair of pants. However, at this moment, Marquis Weiyuan quickly finished off one of the sweet and sour pork ribs before staring at the remaining ribs on the plate. As he watched, Zheng reached out and stole away one more rib, so there was one left on that blue porcelain plate. Marquis Weiyuan immediately sent his chopsticks flying towards that last pork rib on the plate, but sparks flew as he suddenly met with another pair of silver chopsticks on his way. Marquis Weiyuan's gaze traced the chopsticks back to their owner, only to see the normally composed Lord Gu with his cheeks bulging. His eye twitched and he quickly spoke up, "Brother Gu, I touched it first. Move your chopsticks away. Brotherly, I'm older than you by a year. When you were younger, I gave in to you all the time. This time, you should let your older brother have a turn." Brother Gu, Your mouth is still full. Marquis Weiyuan and Lord Gu, who were practically twins since birth, had suddenly started arguing over a single sweet and sour pork rib. He Changqi's awkwardness upon witnessing this scene didn't prevent him from continuously reaching out to grab some poached fish slices at all. It was good that they were arguing anyway. As a result, no one was fighting with him over this plate of fish. Although third sister-in-law had sent over an entire bowl the last time, it hadn't been enough. Furthermore, he had a big appetite, so he hadn't eaten his fill yet. This time, perhaps due to consideration for the guests, Chu Lian had prepared a much larger portion. That soft, tender, white meat was paired with the fiery fragrance of chili, yet it still melted in the mouth like butter. It was so tasty he even felt like swallowing his tongue along with it. Right after he had placed a thin slice of fish in his mouth, he caught sight of Xiao Bojian, who was sitting across from him, reaching into the large plate with a spoon. After some quick maneuvering with his chopsticks, when his spoon was lifted up from the sea of red chilis, it was full of tender, white fish slices. Following that, He Changqi watched with wide eyes as Xiao Bojian poured all the fish slices into his small white porcelain bowl. Next, his empty spoon reached out once again towards the plate of poached fish. What the heck? What happened to their noblemen's gathering? There were only hungry ghosts sitting at this table. A meal that should have been filled with conversation, laughter, and drink ended in just an hour. Chapter 215. Lies 3. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. As He Changqi looked at his friends holding their full bellies and leaning against their seats, burping with satisfaction, the corners of his mouth couldn't help but twitch. Luckily, he had noticed that the situation was turning a little strange, so he had sent all the servants out of the room. Otherwise, if they had let their servants witness that battle just now, their servants would surely have thought that the whole group of gentlemen had been switched out for some impostors. They would likely have thought that the impostors must have been picked out from some beggars who hadn't eaten for days too. After he looked again at the empty plates and dishes on the table that had practically been licked clean, He Changqi couldn't even be bothered to say anything. Once the hungry ghosts before him had rested for a while, Zheng slammed his palm on the table unhappily. "Brother He, you're too selfish. We've always invited you to join us for meals and drinks. The food here is so delicious. How could you wait until today to invite us to your estate for a meal?" Lord Gu shot a sideways glance at He Changqi, whose expression was turning dark. When he thought back to Madame Zhou's actions just now, he realized that the situation was a little delicate. He Changqi had also been wolfing down the food like he hadn't eaten in days. This was probably his first time eating such amazing cuisine too. Lord Gu didn't blame He Changqi like Zheng did. He simply leaned against his chair without any consideration for his image, while sipping at some old duck soup to satisfy his remaining cravings. He spoke with a little sourness in his tone. He Sanlang's quite the lucky one. He deserves to go all the way to that terrible northern border. I pitied that brat at first, but now, I've lost all pity for him. If he were right here in front of me now, I'd tell him, "You deserve it." Now that the sweet and sour pork ribs were all gone, Marquis Weiyuan and Lord Gu were the best of buds again. Poor He Sanlang the Fair. After eating his fill, Xiao Bojian kept a low profile. His eyes were half shut, and his long lashes hid the pools of emotion in his eyes. He pinched his left index finger with his right thumb and index finger. His thin lips were flushed red thanks to the spiciness of the fish from earlier. No one could see the dissatisfaction and resentment in his eyes. He remained as still as a statue. If Zheng wasn't familiar with his personality, he might have asked his senior brother about his mood. Xiao Bojian's eyes swept over He Changqi, a hidden glint in their depths. All of this should have been his. Lianer personally cooking for him, praising Lianer's skills in front of his friends, Lianer helping him to manage the household, facing each day as a couple, exchanging sweet nothings, supporting each other through the trials of life. Right after the group had just finished an unforgettable meal, a manservant entered the room with a wine gourd in hand. The manservant looked at the now empty dishes on the table with shock. He blinked a few times in disbelief before coming to his senses. He quickly walked over to He Changqi's side and lowered his voice to ask, "Eldest young master, do Do you still want to serve this wine? The manservant had gone to fetch the 10-year-old Udonkan wine, which Marquis Weiyuan had specially brought over. Who could have thought that the food would be completely decimated before the wine had even reached the table? Zheng looked around the group of gentlemen and said, "Just serve the wine." Marquis Weiyuan and Lord Gu nodded. They had already filled their bellies, so the wine wouldn't hurt them. Since they had had such a great meal, they were starting to have the interest to drink some wine. He Changchi nodded and ordered the manservant to call in 2 maidservants to clear out the empty dishes. He then had the main kitchen send out some food to have with the wine, so that they could all drink their fill. After tasting those amazing delicacies, they didn't have any appetite from looking at those normal dishes. They even felt a little depressed. The men had the feeling that their days were going to be rough from now on. As the saying went, it's easy for the frugal to become extravagant, but it's hard to reverse the process. After having such delectable gourmet food, it was going to be hard to swallow down their usual fare. With those thoughts in their head, all of them drank more than usual to drown out those depressing thoughts. The 10-year Udonkan was considered one of the strongest spirits in the capital and packed a punch. Furthermore, the men couldn't bring themselves to eat the food that the main kitchen had sent over, so they ended up drinking even more. After an hour, even He Changchi, who usually had a great tolerance for alcohol, was drunk and incoherent, let alone the rest. When the manservant saw the state that the men were in, he could only order some servants to bring the gentlemen to rest in some rooms. The seemingly woozy Xiao Bojian was brought to a private room by an average-looking manservant. Once they were alone, those originally misty eyes abruptly awakened. His gaze was sober and calm, completely lacking any sign of his earlier drunkenness. The average-looking manservant, who was one in disguise, bowed to his master. "Master, you're not drunk?" Xiao Bojian made a vague sound in reply before rubbing his temples. "Follow me to the inner court of the Jing'an estate. Leave 19 here to guard this place." TL note: I couldn't find any information about Udonkan wine, unfortunately. The author might have made it up for the story W. Chapter 216. Taken advantage of. 1. One's brows drew together and his lips parted in preparation to give voice to an objection. However, when he met with Xiao Bojian's icy gaze, he lowered his head and kept his thoughts to himself. It was just past 1 p.m., so most of the servants in the Jing'an estate's inner court had already gone to rest or slack about. On their way to the inner court, they didn't bump into anyone at all. After walking for a moment, Xiao Bojian pulled out a crude map from his sleeve. He looked down at it and checked his bearings before moving directly towards Songtao Court. One followed behind Xiao Bojian closely while watching his surroundings with caution. Chu Lian had finally managed to sneak in a half-day break at that waterside pavilion. She was lying in the pavilion having a nice afternoon nap right now. When a light breeze passed by, it brought along the mild fragrance of the chrysanthemums around them. When Xian saw that her master had fallen asleep, she gently placed a thin woven blanket over Chu Lian before carefully retreating to the zither room nearby. She sat herself at a table and worked on some embroidery as she guarded Chu Lian. Xiao Bojian entered Songtao Court through a small path in the garden and walked slowly while holding up the corner of his robe. It was already autumn, so the most of the flowers in the courtyard were withering, painting a yellow and bleak scene. Xiao Bojian's gaze swept over the arrangements of the courtyard as if memorizing them. In his mind, he was already thinking of building an even larger and even more exquisite estate for Chu Lian to live in, once she finally became his. As wild thoughts ran in his head, a flash of color at the corner of his vision caught his attention. His leisurely expression changed as his pupils contracted. He turned his head unconsciously and focused his gaze on that small splash of color. Not far away in the pavilion by the waterside, a girl wearing a simple light green dress laid sleeping on a wooden lounge chair. One arm was nested underneath her head, while the other was in the midst of slipping off the armrests. Her wide sleeves had slid down to her elbows, revealing her forearms. Her tender, white skin shone starkly against the dark-colored wooden armrests. Her slender little fingers were slightly opened, and her small fingernails were unpainted, giving off a natural and cute impression. Xiao Bojian stood still, frozen to the spot, his gaze landing greedily on that woman's slim body. One looked at his master's expression and pressed his lips together. Despite his desire to speak, he suppressed his inner thoughts once again. Xiao Bojian's hands clenched into fists under his wide sleeves. After a short moment, he gave his orders in a low voice. 1. Take care of that handmaid over there. When he followed Xiao Bojian's line of sight, one noticed the handmaid working on some embroidery in the open zither room nearby. He cupped his fists in acknowledgement to his master before leaping into the air and disappearing from sight. In just a few minutes, Zion's body collapsed as she fainted. One then moved Xiyin to lie against one of the wooden supports in the zither room. When Xiao Bojian saw that one had finished his task, he strode towards the pavilion. Despite his calm outer appearance, his heart was beating like a drum. With every step he took that brought him closer to Chu Lian, his heart seemed to quicken a beat. When he entered the pavilion, he stopped by that sandalwood chair and looked upon the girl he had been thinking of day and night. His heartbeat paused for an instant before pulsing ever faster, almost leaping out of his chest. He tilted his head downwards and took in the entirety of Chu Lian's appearance in his eyes. She was sound asleep, her hair scattered over the back of that lounge chair. Some loose strands were dancing along with the passing autumn breeze, inadvertently plucking at the strings of his heart. Chapter 217. Taken advantage of. 2. The girl's eyes were closed, her thick eyelashes covering her lower eyelids like two small fans. Her fair skin and shapely nose were framed by the slight flush on her cheeks. Her pink lips were parted slightly in her sleep. Chu Lian wasn't an unmatched beauty by any means, but she looked lovely and innocent when she was deep in sleep like this, like a little creature that needed protecting. As Xiao Bojian greedily devoured the enchanting scene with his eyes, he slowly bent down and reached out with his elegant fingers to touch the beauty before him. Right before his fingers were about to touch Chu Lian's soft cheeks, he curled his fingers back and retreated. In the end, he had to muster up all the reason he had to hold back from touching her face. However, he didn't pull his hand back. His fingers twitched slightly before tracing the curve of Chu Lian's profile. His finger glided over that lovely raised nose and passed over those parted petal-like lips before sliding along the distinguished line of her chin and reaching her collarbones. His eyes followed the lines of her collarbones and went even further down, seemingly out of his control. The collar of her dress was made up of 2 lotus flowers, and there was a light yellow piece of fabric peeking out from in between. The fabric below her collar was held up by the curves of her figure underneath, and even further down was her light green skirt. A cute little pair of shoes were exposed under the skirt. Xiao Bojian's eyes turned a little bloodshot, and his breathing became heavier. He forced himself to pull his hand back and shifted his eyes back to Chu Lian's pretty little face instead. Chu Lian had been in the middle of a very comfortable nap. However, she suddenly felt a slight chill at her side, as if some danger had approached her body. Her brows drew together unconsciously, and her mouth moved in her sleep. The tip of her tongue reached out a little from her mouth and glided along her pink lips. The originally innocent-looking girl had suddenly turned a little more seductive and charming thanks to this unconscious action. Chu Lian shifted in her sleep and pulled out the arm that had been under her head, turning to one side instead and gathering her arms together. Xiao Bojian had frozen to the spot when he noticed Chu Lian moving. When he realized that she hadn't woken up, he relaxed and let out a small sigh. However, as he watched her change poses, the primal urges that he had been suppressing surged up again, seemingly about to overwhelm his rational mind at any moment. Due to her movement, Chu Lian's collar had parted, and that light yellow fabric underneath was even more visible now. Furthermore, her new sideways pose meant that more of the fair white skin underneath her collar was now exposed. Xiao Bojian's mind had been blown apart by this scene. His restraint and reason vanished in the space of a second, and he suddenly bent down, hands grabbing on the armrests of the sandalwood chair. To hell with patience and self-control. Leander should have been his. If not for that Empress Dowager's decree, how could he have lost Leander to House Jingon? How could she have become He Changdi's wife? He Changdi was at the northern border now, so who knew if he would even be able to return? Once he gathered enough power, he was going to erase He Changdi from the earth, without even a grave to mark his existence. While these hateful and painful thoughts passed through his mind, Xiao Bojian was already face to face with Chu Lian. Up close, Chu Lian's skin looked even more soft and tender, like the skin of a fresh peach. The warmth of her breath tickled his face. With eyes as deep as the ocean, he took in every little expression of hers with greedy eyes. Finally, he lowered his head and met the moist, pink lips before him with his own. Chapter 218. A Close Shave 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. The soft feeling on his lips was like the headiest wine, leaving him drunk with emotions. He parted his lips a little more and even brought his tongue to play. With his restraint long lost, he slid a hand further downwards. While trapped in deep sleep, Chu Lian suddenly felt a chill all over her body. When she felt something cold touch her lips, she abruptly opened her eyes and was immediately met with that graceful, handsome face up close. Rage burst forth like a volcano in her mind, manifesting outwardly as a furious glare. Her first reaction was to bite down hard while her hands pushed with all her might at the person holding her down. Xiao Bojian was still immersed in his emotions and was caught off guard when Chu Lian pushed him. He couldn't catch his balance and retreated a few steps. It was only after that he felt the pain on his lips. His gaze darkened, and he reached out to wipe his lower lip before bringing his fingers up to his eyes. His head was bent down as he looked at the streak of bright red blood on his hand. He then raised his head to stare at Chu Lian. "Lianer, it's me." It was him. It wasn't some stranger. How could Lianer treat him like that? Chu Lian was nauseous with disgust. She had already climbed off the lounge chair in her panic and retreated as far back as she could, all the way to the other side of the pavilion. Her brows were drawn tightly together as she glared at Xiao Bojian. She hadn't expected Xiao Bojian to be so shameless. How could he have taken advantage of her while she was asleep? Calling him a beast would be an insult to all animals. She was already married. How could he do something so immoral? In comparison, although her husband He Sanlang was a little crazy, he was still a proper gentleman. Furthermore, how had he come to the inner court of the Jing'an estate? In just a short moment, Chu Lian's mind was already filled with hundreds of thoughts and doubts. She realized that the main events in the original story hadn't changed their course despite her interference. However, many of the smaller details and events were already different. It seemed that she wouldn't be able to depend on the events she had read in the book to avoid disasters in the future. She had to make more thorough backup plans and preparations. Chu Lian furrowed her brows, eyes full of caution. "Mr. Xiao, why are you here?" If Chu Lian hadn't checked the surroundings and found out that there was no one around, she would have started shouting. She didn't want to stay around this dangerous man even a second longer. When Xiao Bojian noticed the caution in Chu Lian's eyes, a pang of pain pierced his heart. He quickly tried to explain, "Lianer, we haven't met in so long. I just wanted to see you." Only ghosts would believe that. If you just wanted to see me, then why did you have to attack me? Chu Lian didn't believe in Xiao Bojian's excuse one bit. Chu Lian pressed her lips together. She had caught sight of the unconscious Shi Yin, who had somehow fainted against a pillar in the zither room not too far away. When she connected it back to how Wanlan had fainted back in Defeng Tea House, she became even more vigilant. This was the inner court of the Jing'an estate. Although it was already after 1 p.m. and there weren't many servants about, if anyone happened across this situation, she wouldn't be able to clear her name no matter what. Although the Great Wu dynasty was more open-minded, women would always be on the losing end of things. Furthermore, she was a newlywed wife whose husband wasn't at home. It would be hard for anyone not to suspect her of consorting with another man. "Since you've already seen me, it's about time for you to leave, Mr. Xiao." Chu Lian tried her best to use a level tone to speak. Although Xiao Bojian wasn't very strong himself, he had a skilled bodyguard. This was something that the original novel had mentioned. Thus, despite how frustrated Chu Lian was, she did her best to control her rage. She was afraid that Xiao Bojian would lose his rationality and call out his bodyguard to attack her if she provoked and angered him. Her few paltry self-defense skills were nothing in front of a skilled martial artist like that. Xiao Bojian's long and narrow eyes were focused tightly on the frightened girl before him. His arms were placed behind his back, hiding the fists that were clenched from exerting every bit of his self-control. Leonor, didn't you miss me at all? I know I was in the wrong for leaving you behind that day. I'm a bastard. I've been sunken in my guilt for all these days. Leonor, you have to believe me. Can you believe me in just this once? If something like that day happens again, I won't ever abandon you again. Even if my life is in danger, I'll keep you by my side always and protect you. You'll never suffer a single bit of hurt evermore. Xiao Bojian's voice was brimming with emotion as he spoke. Coupled together with that beautiful metrosexual face of his, it could probably convince any naive and sheltered young ladies in seconds. If she were the original Chu Lian, perhaps she would have been touched enough to run into his embrace. However, what a pity for him. Chu Lian was no longer the original Chu Lian. She wasn't the slightest bit touched. Conversely, she was disgusted beyond belief. Chu Lian didn't even try to discern if Xiao Bojian had any bit of sincerity in his words. She only thought it laughable. She finally realized why she didn't have any feelings for Xiao Bojian even though she had taken over the body of the female lead, his supposed lover, in the story. This man was full of ambition and had the silver tongue to match. Before actual danger approached, he could promise anything he wanted. However, if he were really sincere about protecting her, he should have just shown it with his actions before making the promise. Since he had already abandoned her once, he shouldn't have come back so shamelessly, much less trying to make up for it. Chapter 219, A Close Shave, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian thought once again that He Changdi was much better than Xiao Bojian. At least that man would show his sincerity through his actions, rather than just using meaningless words. She sneered inwardly. Did Xiao Bojian really think that those empty promises would melt her heart? That only showed how much he didn't understand her. Mr. Xiao, don't you know that you're causing trouble for me like this? Right now, I don't have any ties with you at all. Chu Lian lowered her head as she spoke, hiding the annoyance and disgust in her eyes from Xiao Bojian. Xiao Bojian stiffened and looked around anxiously. This place was foreign to him. It was the Jing'an estate, and the woman before him had the title of House Jing'an's third young madam. When his thoughts led him to this realization, it was as if he had lost his soul. He felt as if thorns were piercing him right through the heart. That's right. How could he have forgotten that fact? Such a wonderful and perfect Leonor didn't belong to him right now. The depths of his eyes instantly chilled over, but the guilt in his heart only increased. He took a deep breath and managed to calm down a little. He raised his gaze and stared at Chu Lian. Leonor, I didn't think things through carefully enough. But don't worry, I'll get you out of this and give you a proper title as my wife. You have to wait for me. It won't take too long. Chu Lian was inwardly shocked by his admission, but she didn't dare to display it on her face. She looked downwards without speaking, as if she was pretending to be angry at him. It was clear from Xiao Bojian's expression that he couldn't bear to part with her. However, he pressed his lips together and finally said, Leonor, don't be angry with me. I'm leaving now. Rest assured, we won't be discovered. After saying so, he strode right out of the pavilion. After stepping out, Xiao Bojian paused before adding on, Leonor, the meal you cooked today was delicious. In the future, would you cook for just me alone? Unfortunately, he didn't have the right to say that now. Perhaps Xiao Bojian was really feeling shame and remorse. He didn't even turn back to look at her again after leaving. It wasn't until Xiao Bojian's figure had completely disappeared from sight that Chu Lian dared to raise her head. Her remaining strength left her body and she collapsed on the spot. That was way too dangerous. If she hadn't discovered Xiao Bojian's guilt towards her in time, their meeting wouldn't have ended well for her. If that Xiao Bojian could act so fearlessly even in the Jing'an estate, it looked like just avoiding him wasn't going to work next time. She had to prepare some precautionary measures somehow. Sob. She really didn't like him at all. If she could pay 1,000 taels to stop Xiao Bojian from liking her, she would have gritted her teeth and paid out the full amount. Why was she so unlucky? Chu Lian wiped her lips fiercely with a handkerchief until they were red and sore. Then, she threw the offending handkerchief to the ground in a temper. Xiao Bojian's thin lips looked so soft, pink, and weak. They were pretty much better looking than hers. Wasn't his kiss basically the same as getting kissed by a woman? Chu Lian flipped a table in her mind. She wasn't the type of person who dwelled on things. For the whole incident today, she just treated it as getting bitten by a passing stray dog. Thus, she managed to calm herself down and walked over to Xian to wake her up. When she took a look at the back of Xian's neck, there was a bruise, just like the previous time with Wanlan. After Xian woke up, she was completely panic-stricken. "Third young madam, are you well?" Chu Lian shook her head and helped her up from the floor. "I'm fine." Xian looked Chu Lian up and down. When she saw that her master really seemed okay, she heaved a sigh of relief. Her voice trembled as she asked, "Was it Mr. Xiao?" Chu Lian knew that she couldn't hide this matter from Xian, so she nodded. Xian's cheeks immediately puffed up, shaking with anger as she said, "He? How dare he? This is the Jing'an estate." Chu Lian was also helpless. Xiao Bojian was indeed very bold. If she hadn't made use of his guilt towards her today, he probably wouldn't have left so quickly. When Xian noticed Chu Lian's silence, she quickly tried to reassure her. "Third young madam, please don't worry too much. As long as we don't associate with him, he can't do anything to third young madam." Chu Lian couldn't be bothered to say any more on the matter. She had already lost the interest to nap by this time. She simply ordered listlessly, "Let's return to our courtyard." Xian answered her and quickly followed behind third young madam. However, she had already decided in her heart to send Wenqing and Wanlan with her master, no matter where she went. While full of suppressed emotion, Xiao Bojian quickly strode along. Since Xiao Bojian had left that pavilion, one had already come out of the shadows to follow behind his master. He kept a watchful eye on their surroundings as they left the inner court of the Jing'an estate. Along the way, he even knocked out 2 servants who had been passing through the gardens. No matter how skilled he was in martial arts, he couldn't make any careless mistakes while protecting his master. Just as Xiao Bojian was passing through the door connecting the outer and inner courts, he was caught by someone's gaze. Madame Zhou couldn't stop worrying when she wasn't serving by her husband's side. When she heard that her husband's friends had been sent to rest after getting drunk, she had gone to the outer court to check on the situation. However, on her way back to the inner court, she suddenly spotted a familiar figure. Xiao Bojian's appearance was rather outstanding and would attract a second look from anyone, regardless of gender. No matter how much he tried to keep a low profile with his dressing and personality, he couldn't hide his extraordinary looks. TL note: the author put the table flip emoji there, so I kept it in the text. Chapter 220, Who Else to Target? 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volare novels. Please read from the original source. Today, Xiao Bojian was dressed in a dark green round-collared robe with a matching green belt tie around his waist. Other than a simple square piece of jade, he hadn't hung anything on his belt, let alone a small pouch for some accessories. Although he was dressed in such a low-key color, to the point that it could even act as camouflage, his broad shoulders and narrow waist carried the robe well and made him stand out instead. Under his round collar, there was an inner piece of fabric that extended beyond the collar and wrapped around his throat, giving him an air of restraint. Changqi's close friends were rather good-looking, and they all came from distinguished family backgrounds. Thus, their temperaments and dressing stood out above most. However, when they stood next to Xiao Bojian, they paled in comparison and became foils to his handsomeness instead. Thus, Xiao Bojian had given Madame Zhou a very deep impression from just that short period at the small gathering today. The moment she caught sight of his back, she could tell who it was. Although Xiao Bojian wasn't really well known amongst the social circles of the nobility in the capital, he did have some fame in the Imperial College. Even Madame Zhou had heard of Xiao Bojian once or twice before. Her gaze was stuck on Xiao Bojian's back until he vanished through that connecting door. Next, she traced the small path he had taken with her eyes, and she realized what laid in that direction. At the end of the small path that Xiao Bojian had just taken was Songtao Court. Suddenly, all sorts of thoughts flared up in Madame Zhou's head. In a short moment, she clenched her fists in excitement. By the time Zheng and the rest had woken up from their drunken stupors, they attempted to stay in the Jing'an estate for dinner. When he thought back to those new delicacies he had eaten at lunch, Zheng even wanted to badger He Changqi to let him stay over at the Jing'an estate for some time. Sob, sob, sob. That damned He Sanlang was way too lucky. Why did the heavens bestow him with such a virtuous wife who could cook so well? I can't go on like this. I have to get grandmother to send someone to housing to check if they have any single ladies to wed when I get home. He Changqi didn't know how to react. These friends of his. Normally, he'd have to invite them a few times before they would come over. However, now they were trying to drag out their stay, and were even refusing to leave. Did they have to be so shameless? He Changqi was a little troubled. If these dishes had been made by his own wife, then he would have just treated them to one meal. However, it was third sister-in-law who had cooked the meal. He wasn't so shameless as to trouble her again. Isn't that enough for today? Did you forget your manners? My sister-in-law isn't a cook at your beck and call. Marquis Weiyuan complained with a cry of, "Brother, he's being petty." However, they were all gentlemen, so they understood the rationale behind He Changqi's statement. As much as they really wanted to have another meal, they could only stop with their requests. Each of them sighed with laments. They suspected that they wouldn't be able to eat anything else when they returned home to their estates. He Changqi was rather helpless upon seeing the situation like this. He suddenly recalled something that his grandmother had mentioned offhand to him while chatting the other day. He then called out to the men who were on their way out, "If you really want to eat third sister-in-law's cooking again, you can wait until Gillen Restaurant opens again." Grandmother gave her Gillen Restaurant over to third sister-in-law to manage, so it shouldn't be too long before it reopens. Really? Honored Lady Jeannie is going to run a restaurant? The three of them were overjoyed. Since Chu Lian was going to open a restaurant, it was definitely going to have some specialties. Thus, if they craved for those delicious foods in the future, they wouldn't need to throw away their dignity to beg He Changqi for a meal then. I'll definitely let all of you know when third sister-in-law's restaurant reopens. With this news in mind, the group returned home in high spirits. The next day, Chu Lian brought Wenqing and Wanlan along with her to Gillen Restaurant again. She passed on some instructions regarding the restaurant's renovations before rushing home. The renovations were almost done. She had chosen a chef from one of the servants who had followed her from House Ing when she had gotten married. The novel had mentioned this person before. He was a loyal servant, and the original Chu Lian had frequently used him to send letters out to Xiao Bojian. Mao Zhangji's parents were still alive and well, and they were all servants under Chu Lian's name. He was 18 this year. His father used to be a third-rank cook in Housing, so he had learned some culinary skills from his father at a young age. He did have some talent in cooking. Chu Lian had never kept her handmaids and senior servants away while she was cooking. Xian was meticulous and had learned how to cook quite a few dishes from her, so Chu Lian sent her to teach Mao Zhangji how to make the specialties for Gillen Restaurant. From Xian's report, Mao Zhangji had already managed to learn most of them. He was even better at cooking some of the dishes compared to his temporary teacher, Xian. Last night, she had specially ordered Mao Zhangji to cook dinner for Songtao Court. After tasting his handiwork, Chu Lian was pleased. The bookkeeping was still left to Gillen Restaurant's old bookkeeper Wang. As for the manager, she let manager Qin, the manager she had temporarily borrowed from matriarchy, take up the post. In the past few days, the 30-something manager Qin had been very diligent and conscientious in his work for her. What was even more rare was that he wasn't stuck in old ways and was open to new ideas. He was also quite smooth when it came to talking business. He was the third son of matriarchy's main steward. The matriarch had been thinking of training him to become a main steward at first, but she had specially sent manager Qin over due to her love for Chu Lian. Thus, his abilities were definitely top-notch. After some discussion, Chu Lian and matriarch had decided that the 1st of September was a good day. Thus, the reopening of Gillen Restaurant was set to be on that date. Chu Lian had already prepared gold-embossed invitations to be sent out. All she had to do next was to decide who to invite. Chapter 221. Who else to target? 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volare novels. Please read from the original source. Both matriarch He and the servants in Chu Lian's courtyard were looking forward to Gillen Restaurant's reopening. Gillen Restaurant held a special place in Matriarchy's heart. As for the third branch, the restaurant was going to be a very important source of income for them. Sailing had ventured out to the northern border by himself. Who knew when he would be able to return to this courtyard? Third young madam was all alone in the estate, and her dowry was rather pitiful. She also wasn't in line to manage the estate. The expenses of their branch were paid from the estate's shared accounts, but they still had to have some personal funds to use freely. Otherwise, they would definitely be looked down upon by others. Back in the Ing estate, she was just a young miss, so it was fine if she didn't have much money of her own. However, Chu Lian was now the lady in charge of the third branch, so she had to have some funds squared away. Furthermore, third young madam wasn't miserly. If she got rich one day, she would naturally award her servants richly as well. Thus, from senior servants Gue and Zhong to the menial servants sweeping the floors in the courtyard, all of them were hoping that third young madam's Gillen Restaurant would do well and prosper. In the end, Chu Lian turned out to be the most relaxed person in the estate. She just ate, drank, and slept all day, enjoying what little pleasures she could. Gillen Restaurant's reopening seemed to be an event as ordinary as her daily calligraphy practice to her. As the date of the reopening drew closer, even Xian started to get anxious. However, her master was just lying on a lounge chair and eating some candied fruits while casually flipping through a newly published comedy book. Looking at her master's overly relaxed appearance, Xian didn't know whether to complain or relax along with Chu Lian. She walked over to Chu Lian with a few different types of fabric in hand. Third young madam, which color should we use for the drapes in the private rooms? When Chu Lian heard Xian's words, she didn't even look up. She was in the middle of an exciting part of her book. You can decide that yourself. You don't have to come to me for these small matters. If she had to be consulted for details as small as the colors of the drapes, wouldn't she be overwhelmed with work in the future when she had more stores in hand? She was reopening Gillen Restaurant so that she could earn more money and enjoy life, not to create more troubles and work for herself. Her final goal was to become a carefree and relaxed layabout. Xian felt a little helpless, but she knew that third young madam's words were the law. Thus, she quietly picked out a color that she liked. However, she didn't leave after that and continued talking. Third young madam, should we train 2 more loyal cooks? Chu Lian finally looked up from her book and turned to Xian. Why do you say that? Seeing that third young madam was finally paying attention to her, Xian got a little excited. Third young madam, have you seen those large restaurants in the capital? They're always so full to the point that there aren't any empty seats. The restaurants with some unique specialties usually have a long queue outside. How will Cook Mao be able to manage everything alone? Won't he be overworked? After hearing Xian's words, Chu Lian smiled and put down her book. She then took up a teacup from the table next to her and sipped some honey water. Xian, you're overthinking things. I'm planning to have only about 20 tables of guests each day. Xian's eyes widened in shock, and she said in disbelief, Third young madam, didn't you say that you were going to make Gillen Restaurant famed throughout the capital and defeat that Yueheng Restaurant on Zhuke Avenue? With just around 20 tables of guests a day, how are they going to win Yueheng Restaurant? Just the amount of income daily was definitely not going to be enough to support the restaurant's expenses. After seeing Xian's astonishment, Chu Lian couldn't resist the urge to chuckle. She looked just like a cute little white fox whose tricks had finally succeeded. Silly girl. I'll give you an example. If there was a set of armor that could protect your whole body and there was only one like it in the whole world, then it would be a one-of-a-kind treasure. All the warriors in the world would definitely pit their lives to win it. If there were 10 sets of this armor, then it could be called a rarity. If there were suddenly 10,000 sets of it, there would be enough to outfit every single member of the city guards. Then this armor would no longer be a treasure, and it would simply be some common rubbish. Xian wasn't slow. After getting Chu Lian's guidance, it was as if she had woken up from a dream. Actually, this was very simple common sense. Everyone knew that the value of things was pegged to their rarity. Otherwise, why would Hutian Jade be something that even money couldn't buy? The easier it was to get something, the less people would treasure it. This applied to third young madam's secret recipes as well. As long as the restaurant built up a good reputation and kept its services rare, it would definitely attract the nobility of the capital, to the point that they might even fight over it. By then, even if they set the cost to reserve a single table as 100 taels, there would still be buyers lining up with cash in hand. The difference between earning 100 taels from 100 tables versus earning 100 taels from a single table was like heaven and earth. Chu Lian's eyes sparkled as she looked at Shi Yin. Do you understand now? Shi Yin's expression had also turned to joy. She stared at her master with admiration, just so happening to look like a loyal little puppy. Chu Lian smiled. This was what she had planned from the moment she had decided to reopen Gillen Restaurant. Who had the most money to spend in the Great Wu dynasty? It was the nobility, of course. She was a madam of House Jingen, and also held the title of Honored Lady Jenny now. She was starting off with an advantage, and she didn't need to fear some nobles trying to use their status to take advantage of her business. Furthermore, she would feel more at peace with herself if she targeted the nobles. The purses of those distinguished houses were all stuffed full of money. Who else would she target if not them? If she had to go against her conscience and target the commoners who earned their money with blood, sweat, and tears, she wouldn't be able to do it. After another day passed, Chu Lian made her preparations early in the morning and went over to Qingxi Hall. Today, she was to accompany Matriarch He to make a visit to the Zheng estate. They had just gotten ready and were about to head over to the outer court to board the carriage when a steward came over to report that House Zheng had sent someone over. Matriarch He quickly ordered the servants to guide the person from House Zheng into Qingxi Hall. It was the main steward of the Zheng estate who had come. The moment he entered, he fell to the ground on his knees and knelt before Matriarch He. Matriarch He, please allow Honored Lady Jenny to save our old Duke Zheng. Chapter 222. Old Gourmet 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian stared with eyes wide open in shock. Had this steward gotten her mixed up with someone else? Please, she wasn't a doctor and she didn't know how to treat people. She didn't have any miraculous cure-all either. How was she supposed to save old Duke Zheng? Matriarch He was also confused. However, the steward kneeling at her feet didn't seem to be lying. The anxiety and grief in his expression wasn't something that could be faked so easily. What's going on? Sanlang's wife doesn't know medicine. How can she save old Duke Zheng? Upon hearing Matriarch He's questions, House Zheng's steward blushed for an instant. However, he couldn't hide the truth anyway, so he explained the circumstances in full to Matriarch He and Chu Lian. Even when Chu Lian had already boarded House Zheng's carriage, she was still a little dizzy from the sudden turn of events. What a strange predicament this was. Who could have expected that old Duke Zheng's illness had been caused by the lack of gourmet dishes that fit his exacting tastes? No wonder House Zheng had kept this matter sealed up so tightly. The explanation they gave to outsiders was that old Duke Zheng was getting on in age, and his health was declining to the point that he was bedridden. If the social circles of the nobility were to find out that old Duke Zheng had stopped eating due to his pickiness over food, and that it had caused the decline in his health, wouldn't they laugh until their faces cramped up? House Zheng would also become the laughingstock of the capital if that were to happen. The corners of Chu Lian's mouth twitched. This old Duke Zheng had really contracted a very strange illness. Chu Lian also finally understood why old Duchess Zheng had been so anxious to invite her to their estate. Luckily, Chu Lian wasn't a cold-hearted person. Since they had come to her for help due to the circumstances, she was happy to oblige. As the saying goes, there is more merit in saving a person's life than in building a 7-story pagoda. Furthermore, the person in need here was old Duke Zheng, who had a good reputation in the capital. However, she couldn't make an empty promise. She had only told House Zheng's steward that she would try her best. Even so, that steward had thanked her profusely, as if he had finally found the help they needed. While watching Chu Lian's actions, Matriarch He had given a nod of approval inwardly. Sanlang's wife was kind but not too soft. She knew her own limits and hadn't tried to show off her skills. Although she was a little lazy normally, when it came to major events, she was good at keeping the situation under control. On the way to the Zheng estate, Chu Lian hadn't been idle. She started by asking the steward what old Duke Zheng liked to eat, before asking after his physical health. After thinking it over in her mind, She started forming an initial list of dishes to make. Once the steward got honored Lady Jeannie's instructions, he immediately ordered one of the manservants in their party to rush back to the estate to prepare the ingredients that honored Lady Jeannie required. Matriarch He and Chu Lian finally reached the Zheng estate after half an hour. They got off the carriage at the side gate of the estate and were led into the inner court by old Duchess Zheng herself. They then entered old Duke Zheng's bedroom. When Heir Zheng returned to the estate, he noticed a few carriages parked outside the side gate and one of the estate's grooms taking care of the horses. Xiao Bojian dismounted from his horse and looked carefully at the carriages. He spoke his observations in a baffled tone. Tiancheng, those seem to be House Jing'an's carriages. Heir Zheng looked more closely at the symbols on the carriage and agreed. The heir only knew that his grandfather's health was failing, but his parents hadn't told him the reason for his grandfather's illness. Thus, Heir Zheng was still in the dark about the situation. He shot a glance at his manservant. The quick-witted manservant got the message and quickly went over to inquire about the carriages. In a short moment's time, he returned and whispered something into Heir Zheng's ear. Heir Zheng's expression turned into one of surprise. Brother Xiao, House Jing'an's matriarch and honored Lady Jeannie, have come to visit my estate. Xiao Bojian was also a little surprised. At the same time, a sweet feeling suffused his heart. See, he and Lianer were still connected by fate. He had even bumped into her here at the Zheng estate. Chapter 223, Old Gourmet, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Honored Lady Jeannie's delicious cooking was still fresh in Heir Zheng's mind. Unfortunately, his grandfather's health had been declining day by day recently, so he wasn't in the mood to think about food. However, since honored Lady Jeannie had specially prepared those dishes for them that day, he decided to thank her personally if he happened to meet her in the inner court. A glint flashed in Xiao Bojian's eyes, but he didn't say anything. However, he had already formed a plan inwardly. Although Xiao Bojian was good friends with Heir Zheng, he was still an outsider and a male at that. It wasn't appropriate for him to enter the inner court of the Zheng estate. He regularly came to the Zheng estate as a guest, but he rarely set foot into the inner court. He would usually follow Heir Zheng to his study in the outer court. Today was no exception. Old Duchess Zheng had already been waiting at the entrance of her courtyard. Once she caught sight of Matriarch He and Chu Lian, she immediately stepped forward in welcome. When she was within arm's reach, she grasped Matriarch He's hands with tears in her eyes. "Old sister, you've finally come." Matriarch He patted her hand and reassured her, "You don't have to stand on courtesy with us. Let's go in to see old Duke Zheng first. Do tell Sanlang's wife if there's anything that old Duke Zheng can't eat." Old Duchess Zheng wiped away her tears and nodded. Following that, she led Chu Lian and Matriarch He into the bedroom. Old Duke Zheng was indeed quite ill. He seemed to be sleeping in a lethargic state and was in the midst of dreaming. He was even mumbling something unintelligible. However, he barely had any strength and his voice was so soft that Chu Lian had to move right next to him before she could hear what he was saying. The moment she could finally make something out, she didn't know how to react. Old Duke Zheng was already 1 foot in the coffin, but even in his dreams, he was mumbling, "Oranges, crabs." How much of a gourmet was this old Duke Zheng? Chu Lian didn't know how to check pulses, let alone anything to do with traditional Chinese medicine. There was still an imperial physician checking on old Duke Zheng's pulse next to his bed, so Chu Lian asked the physician what foods the old Duke had to avoid in his condition. When she finally had a good understanding of what he couldn't eat, she led Xian and Mingyan over to the small kitchen that the Zheng estate had already prepared in advance. The kitchen was outfitted with plenty of fresh ingredients. Some had even been sent in not too long ago after Chu Lian's instructions on the way here. It was the middle of autumn now, so it was just the time when crabs would be meaty and tasty. It was also the time when oranges ripened, so no wonder the old gourmet duke would be thinking of those two foods even in his sleep. Since he clearly wanted to eat those, Chu Lian already knew what to do. How about some stuffed orange with crab meat? Just like how you had to have the right medicine to cure a certain illness, you had to make sure the right dish matched the cravings of the diner. Stuffed orange with crab meat wasn't hard to make. They just had to pick some good, fresh oranges and a fat crab. They did have crab here in this kitchen, but they didn't have any oranges here. She ordered Yin to notify the servant waiting outside to find her some quality oranges. It was the season for oranges, so they shouldn't be too hard to find. The senior servant then brought 2 maidservants with her and quickly headed off to the outer court to find the steward in charge of buying ingredients. Yin prepared the crab herself, digging out the meat within the shell and giving instructions to Yin by her side. Yin was sent off to cook some ginseng porridge. The crabs were ready in a short moment. By then, the senior servant had already returned with the fresh oranges that Yin needed. The oranges were brightly colored and fragrant with a nice, even shape. At one look, you could tell that they were quality oranges. They had to cut open the oranges, remove the contents within, and then pack it with stuffing made of crab meat, pork, water chestnuts, ground ginger, and rice wine. After covering it back up with the cap they cut off the top, they had to put it on a steamer basket and steam it. TL note. Sounds weird, but interesting? Wonder what it tastes like. Stuffed orange with crab meat, fancier version for Old Duke Sheng. Chapter 224. Old Gourmet 3. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. The servant who had brought the ingredients didn't dare to stay in the kitchen and watch. She lowered her head and led the other maidservants out and took her post by the kitchen entrance again. Yin washed the oranges before passing them to Yin. In order to make them look more appetizing, Yin carefully carved out some simple patterns on the skins of the fruits. After that, she cut them open. When it came to the third orange, as she slid the knife into the orange, it was suddenly blocked by something within. Yin frowned and pulled the orange apart. Somehow, there was a thin iron capsule within. Yin's eyes widened, and her face was filled with shock. Conversely, Yin had only paused for a moment before calming down. She shot a glance at Yin before looking at Yin, who was busy cooking porridge at the stove, indicating that Yin had to stay quiet. Yin quickly pulled out that thin iron capsule with her nimble fingers. She found the mechanism that kept it closed and activated it, opening the capsule with a quiet click. Inside was a small roll of paper. As for why Yin was so familiar with the capsule's mechanism, she had read it in the original novel before. Xiao Bojian liked to send messages to Yin in this manner. He had used these kinds of iron capsules previously. Before she even opened the paper roll, Yin noticed a small Xiao written on the outside. As expected, this was a message from Xiao Bojian. That Xiao Bojian was still this delusional. He still thought that she liked him and refused to go away. Rage surfaced in Yin's heart. She immediately lost all interest in the note's contents. In front of Yin, she threw the unopened note and capsule into the fire of the stove. Sparks flew from the roaring fire, turning the note into ashes. When Yin saw Yin's actions with her own eyes, a sense of relief came over her heart. She knew that her master didn't have any feelings for Mr. Xiao at all. Her master's decision was right. She was House Jing'an's third young madam now. Even though she wasn't the lady in charge of the main branch, she was still the mistress of the third branch. She also had the title of Honored Lady Genie now. Even if she didn't want to fight for more status and power, she still had to uphold her responsibility and reputation. Furthermore, other than leaving for the northern border, young master hadn't let down third young madam in any other way. Even without including third young master's handsome looks, just based on the He family's rules, it was a house worthy of third young madam's efforts to protect it. For a noble lady who married into a distinguished house, it was quite rare that they didn't have to face an inner court full of their husbands' concubines. Just based on that alone, it was worth the effort for third young madam to keep her reputation clean. Furthermore, He Sanling had a good family background and was so much better than Mr. Xiao. It was all that Mr. Zhao's fault. Their young miss had already married someone else. Why was he still latching onto her like a leech and refusing to let go? She vented her hatred on Xiao Bojian in her heart. The originally kind and gentle handmaid was now questioning Xiao Bojian's ancestors in her mind about the wretch their family had given birth to. Yin glanced at Yin and instructed her in a calm tone. You never saw that. Yin nodded in acknowledgement. After that, Yin continued preparing the oranges as if nothing had happened. 2 hours later, the warming and nourishing ginseng porridge as well as the fragrant stuffed orange with crab meat, were both done. Chu Lian then specially cooked up 2 side dishes with her own hands. Old Duke Zheng had been bedridden for a long time and had stopped eating for quite a few days. He couldn't eat anything hard. Thus, she had picked out some foods with softer textures for him. Chu Lian cleaned up a little before having her maidservants carry the food in some food containers. They then rushed back to old Duke Zheng's bedroom. Back in the Zheng estate's outer court, Xiao Bojian was left alone in the study. Heir Zheng had already rushed off to the inner court. There was a vast collection of books in the Zheng estate study, so Xiao Bojian came over regularly to borrow books. At this moment, the secret guard one was whispering into Xiao Bojian's ear while disguised as a manservant. Xiao Bojian frowned. His tone carried a trace of anger as he spoke. What? She threw the note into the fire without looking at it? One stood respectfully at one side and nodded. Rage rose like a wave in Xiao Bojian's chest. He leaned against the boxwood chair with his eyes shut for a long moment before managing to calm himself down again. Lianer, how could you be so silly? Why don't you trust me? Do you know what I wrote in that note? Bitterness and helplessness were mixed in Xiao Bojian's thoughts. He really wanted to grab that annoying woman and bully her a little to vent his frustrations. TL note, I'll be off on holiday for the next 6 days. If there are any typos, please comment below the chapters and I'll fix them when I get back. Chapter 225, Keeping Her Behind, 1. This time, Xiao Bojian had actually sent a proper message for once. What he had written on that note wasn't flowery professions of love, but he had cried wolf too many times, so no wonder Chu Lian didn't even want to look at it. The contents of that note were related to Chu Lian's father. Through some sheer luck, the normally idle second master of House Ying, Chu Qijing, had somehow gotten a proper 5th-rank position that was actually just a cushy job. Not only that, but he seemed to have gotten connected to the Pan estate somehow. There was definitely something up considering how abnormal this situation was. Xiao Bojian had just wanted to inform Chu Lian of this news and ask if she had any idea what was going on. Unfortunately, that little paper note had already gone up in flames. When Xiao Bojian noticed that his fists had clenched at some point, he realized that he was starting to lose his patience. The autumn examinations. This year, no one was going to stop him. He had borne with so much for 10 years, all for the sake of finally showing off his brilliance in court. He was definitely going to become the person standing at that peak. Chu Lian led her maidservants into old Duke Zheng's bedroom. At this moment, old Duchess Zheng and Matriarch He were both waiting for her in the outer room. When she heard someone report that Chu Lian had come back with the food, old Duchess Zheng couldn't sit still any longer, and she quickly stood up. Matriarch He gently reassured her, "Don't worry, this old woman has faith in the cooking skills of Sanlang's wife." Chu Lian was actually more anxious than the 2 elderly women. She even had a little doubt in her heart. Was old Duke Zheng really going to be cured with just a tasty meal? She was led to old Duke Zheng's bedside. Some maidservants had already set up a small table next to the bed. Chu Lian took the box of food from Xian's hands and personally arranged the dishes one by one on the small table. Chu Lian glanced at the unconscious old Duke Zheng and frowned. Her shiny black eyes darted about in thought before she spoke up in a soft and gentle tone. A superior man possesses extraordinary comprehension and intellect. His excellence within is displayed through his posture and actions without. To seek enlightenment from crabs, today we have offered up some crab and orange. The cool of mid-autumn is when the taste of crabs and oranges are at their best. No wonder old Duke Zheng has them in his thoughts. However, as a gourmand, old Duke Zheng surely must have eaten many fresh crabs and quality oranges before. However, have you ever tried eating crabs and oranges together? This junior has a secret recipe here called stuffed orange with crab meat. With this method of cooking, you could say that the fragrance of oranges and the freshness of the crab have both been expressed fully. Fresh and fragrant, paired with 5 other types of seasonings. If you're not able to taste it in this life, then it would truly be a regret. While Chu Lian was describing the dish, she even opened up one of the stuffed oranges. The originally sealed aroma instantly drifted through the air and filled the room. The whole room was now brimming with a smell that was as fresh and fragrant as Chu Lian had described. Furthermore, Her speech was so tempting that even old Duchess Zheng and matriarchy, as well as the imperial physician waiting on the side, had all secretly sniffed at the air and gulped down some saliva. Of course, this also had an effect on the bedridden old duke. Old Duke Zheng had still been in the midst of unconsciousness. Suddenly, his eyelids twitched and he opened up his wrinkled old eyes. Although his pupils seemed a little misty at first, they quickly turned sharper. His nose wrinkled up, as if detecting the smell of good food in the air. When he finally distinguished what that aroma was made of, his old eyes shone brightly. He struggled to sit up, shouting with a hoarse voice, Quickly, help me up." Chapter 226, Keeping Her Behind, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. When old Duchess Zheng saw that her husband had finally woken up, the tears that she had been holding back dripped down from her eyes. She cried out mournfully, "My Duke, you've finally recovered your appetite." Without waiting for the servants to move, she rushed over to the old Duke's side and personally helped him up to lean against the headboard. Chu Lian was clever enough to recover quickly from her instant of surprise. She moved the small table before old Duke Zheng. Old Duke Zheng had been bedridden for quite a period of time. The struggle just now seemed to have used up all his remaining strength. He couldn't even lift his hand up at this time, so he could only stare right at that plate of stuffed orange with crab meat with his eyes. Old Duchess Zheng quickly took up one of the oranges and fed him personally. Once the soup entered his mouth, old Duke Zheng's eyes shone even brighter. His heart was moved, his eyes were lit up, his nose was flared and his mouth was in the midst of enjoying bliss. After swallowing a mouthful of heaven, old Duke Zheng had completely tossed his idea of fasting to the back of his head. If not for old Duchess Zheng holding him back and not letting him eat too much at once, he would probably have gulped down an entire stuffed orange in 2 or 3 bites. Since old Duke Zheng had woken up and had already broken his fast, it wasn't appropriate if strangers continued staying in the inner room. Leaving old Duchess Zheng inside, the younger Duchess Zheng invited the guests, including the imperial physician, to the outer room. After Duchess Zheng invited matriarch He to take a seat, she curtsied to Chu Lian in gratitude. This was all thanks to honored Lady Jeannie's efforts today. "Please, accept this bow from me." Chu Lian quickly helped the younger Duchess Zheng up. "Madam, please don't stand on ceremony with me. It was just a small matter." Duchess Zheng shook her head. "Honored Lady Jeannie, you don't have to be so humble. Even the imperial cooks couldn't have made such an amazing dish. Honored Lady really has some marvelous ideas. It's awe-inspiring to me." The back of Chu Lian's ears felt a little hot. How were these marvelous ideas? She was merely a gourmet who had collected knowledge from the centuries of cooks before her. Duchess Zheng had really evaluated her too highly. When matriarch saw that her granddaughter-in-law was seemingly embarrassed, she chuckled. "Sanlang's wife, have you made more of those stuffed oranges? If there's more, bring some up for us to taste as well. My appetite has been awoken by your descriptions just now." Chu Lian nodded. "I have." After saying so, she retrieved a larger box of food from Mingyan's hands. The servants had sent over quite a number of oranges to the kitchen just now, and it didn't take much to prepare them. Thus, Chu Lian had made a few more portions, thinking to let everyone have a taste of something new. It was just the right time to bring out the extra portions now. Each person had 1 orange. Even the imperial physician who had come to check on old Duke Zheng had 1. The people present here weren't as picky as old Duke Zheng. Thus, the impact of the gourmet food was even more stronger on them. The imperial physician held on to the empty orange, feeling unsatisfied. He stared at the empty shell in his hands, finally having a shred of sympathy for old Duke Zheng's predicament. After tasting something so carefully prepared and so delicious, having to return to normal fare was like going from heaven to hell. It was extremely painful. Old Duke Zheng had just woken up, so no matter how tasty the food was, old Duchess Zheng didn't dare to give him much of it. She could only try her best to persuade him and finally managed to convince the old Duke. After finishing his meal, old Duke Zheng had used up all the energy he had. He closed his eyes and returned to bed. The imperial physician took this chance to enter the inner room again and checked the old duke's pulse. When he came out, old Duchess Zheng anxiously asked about the old duke's health. The physician smiled and reported that the duke would be fine. Actually, old Duke Zheng had a healthy body and sharp mind despite his age. He was just a little more picky about his food. This time, he had become bedridden due to fasting. So now that he was willingly to eat again, and since Chu Lian had prepared a nourishing meal, his body would recover just fine after some time. In the days ahead, he just had to drink some nourishing decoctions and eat normally. Chapter 227, Keeping Her Behind, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. The ladies of the Zheng estate were overjoyed. Matriarchy was also happy for her old sister upon hearing the news. Since old Duke Zheng was fine now, it wouldn't be appropriate for them to continue disturbing his rest. Thus, Matriarchy wanted to bid her goodbyes for today. Old Duchess Zheng had just agreed to send them off when her daughter-in-law, the younger Duchess Zheng, tugged at her sleeve and shot a look at her. She then whispered a little into old Duchess Zheng's ear. The old woman stiffened for a bit. Her expression turned a little troubled, and she turned to Matriarchy with some embarrassment. She then looked again at the bright-eyed Chu Lian standing behind Matriarchy. Old sister, I have a request. The slight smile on Matriarchy's face disappeared and she stated sternly, although we're not sisters by blood, our friendship is no less closer than any real sisters. What is there that you can't speak of in front of me? After hearing such a generous reassurance from Matriarchy, old Duchess Zheng finally set down her pride to plead. Could you let honored Lady Jeannie stay in the Zheng estate for a few more days? Old sister, you know that my duke has such a picky appetite. I'm afraid that he won't want to eat anything again after waking up. Old Duchess Zheng knew that her request was a little too much. Chu Lian wasn't married to House Zheng, and she didn't have any close connections with House Zheng either. Furthermore, she was already married to someone else. It would be very improper for her to stay at the Zheng estate. Also, this request did make it seem like the old duchess was treating Chu Lian like a mere cook. Even if Chu Lian didn't hold a ranked noble title like she did now, this was a rather degrading request. If this matter didn't concern old Duke Zheng's health, Matriarchy would have thrown a temper at her old sister. When she heard this request, Chu Lian's brows furrowed together. She really wanted to reject it outright. But this was old Duchess Zheng and Matriarchy's conversation. It wasn't her place to speak here, let alone interrupt. Thus, Chu Lian's expectant eyes turned to Matriarchy's face. If the matriarch handed her out without any hesitation at this moment, then Chu Lian would be utterly disappointed at the He family. Any trace of a smile had been completely wiped from Matriarchy's face. A stern expression took its place instead. She looked at her old sister and shook her head after a moment of thought. She firmly said, I know you're anxious, but this request is too unreasonable. Sanlang's wife is still young. I won't be able to rest easy if she's staying out of the Jing'an estate. On top of that, Chu Lian could only help with the pressing matter at hand, but she couldn't take care of old Duke Zheng forever. She wasn't a servant. She was House Jing'an's third young madam, Sanlang's lawfully wedded wife. Chu Lian hadn't expected Matriarch He to have refused the request so resolutely. On one hand, she hadn't been disappointed. On the other, she felt warm inside and her fondness for the He family grew a little more. Due to this fondness, her eyes had lit up brightly with the warmth of her feelings. Old Duchess Zheng also hadn't expected such a curt refusal from her old sister. She didn't know how to round up the current situation. She opened her mouth, but was at a loss for what to say. Old Duchess Zheng also knew that her request had been too overboard, but she was still unhappy that she had been refused so directly. The younger Duchess Zheng didn't know what to say either, so the air around them turned awkward. Chu Lian noticed that the situation was taking a turn for the worse, so after a quick turn of wits, she spoke up, Grandmother, old Duchess Zheng is just worried for the old Duke. Old Duke Zheng is simply craving for good food. As long as he has something new to eat, he should be fine. Actually, this can be solved even without granddaughter-in-law around. When she finished speaking, everyone looked at her with surprise. She really had a solution to this problem? As long as Matriarchy supported her, she would give her best to help them out. If it was just having to make new delicacies for old Duke Zheng, then Chu Lian had plenty of ideas that could work even without her there. TL note: this is the last of the chapters one had translated before I left for my holiday. If you don't see the next chapter tomorrow, that means I wasn't able to translate on the plane or while traveling. Please hang in there until March 9th. I'll be back by then. Love. Chapter 228. A Test. 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Anyway, in the worst-case scenario, she could just pass down some secret recipes to the best cooks in the Zheng estate. After all, she had enough of those so-called secret recipes to hand them out by the dozens. Chu Lian smiled. Old Duchess Zheng, please wait for a moment. I would like to discuss this matter with my grandmother first. You won't be disappointed by the results. Old Duchess Zheng and the younger Duchess Zheng exchanged looks. They had indeed gone overboard with their request, so they felt a little guilty. Since Chu Lian was still trying to compromise despite their rude request, they quickly agreed. Old Duchess Zheng even ordered her handmaid to lead them to a nearby room for privacy. Once they entered the room and closed the door, Matriarchy took Chu Lian's hands into her own. Her tone was still rather miffed as she said, Lianer, they are the ones in the wrong for this matter. You don't have to try to accommodate them. Chu Lian helped Matriarchy to a chair made of yellow peachwood and reassured, Grandmother, I know you're trying to protect me because you're worried I'll be taken advantage of. However, you and Old Duchess Zheng are such old friends, and Old Duchess Zheng was just worried for Old Duke Zheng's health. I think her actions are forgivable. Furthermore, this matter isn't as serious as you think. Granddaughter-in-law has plenty of ways to let Old Duke Zheng eat all the delicacies he wants. Just sit here for a moment and don't worry for granddaughter-in-law. Granddaughter-in-law will take care of everything. Matriarchy stared into Chu Lian's bright eyes. When Chu Lian simply continued to innocently blink at her without a hint of forced reluctance, Matriarchy set aside her worries and smiled. She was indeed close to Old Duchess Zheng and didn't want to make a huge fuss over this. Because the two of them were the matriarchs of their respective houses, it was hard to avoid these sorts of conflicts of interest. No matter how hard they tried, they just had different statuses and different interests at heart. They usually tried to avoid clashing with one another, but if they couldn't come to an agreement, then neither of them would give way. Today, if their roles had been reversed, Old Duchess Zheng would have done the same. However, if there was a solution that fulfilled the interests of both their sides, that would be even better. All right, Grandmother will listen to you. Matriarchy patted Chu Lian's soft little hand. Chu Lian sat right next to Matriarchy. The only people in this room were the trusted servants she had brought from the Jing'an estate, and there weren't any strangers here, so there was no need to observe etiquette so strictly. Chu Lian looked straight at the maidservants she had brought with her today, Xian and Mingyan. Both of them stiffened a little after receiving her gaze. They instantly understood what Chu Lian was thinking about. Actually, after listening to Chu Lian's conversation with Matriarch He, they had already started to have an inkling of what Chu Lian's solution was. Xian's inner conflict was completely exposed from her expression, and her brows started to furrow together. On the other hand, Mingyan didn't seem to show much emotion. Chu Lian quietly observed their reactions and motioned them closer. Xian, Mingyan, come over here. Xian and Mingyan walked up to Chu Lian with their heads lowered before asking in unison, Third young madam, do you have any orders for us? Chu Lian didn't like to beat around the bush, so she immediately said it straight out. I'm sure you've already guessed what I'm thinking of. Old Duke Zheng needs someone to take care of him while he's recovering, but I can't stay behind in the Zheng estate. You've been serving me all this time, and I've never kept my cooking or secret recipes hidden from both of you. You must have learned quite a bit from the daily meals in my courtyard. Now that this chance has come, are either of you willing to stay behind and take care of Old Duke Zheng's meals? As expected, Xian and Mingyan had indeed guessed what their young madam had in mind. By the time Chu Lian had finished telling them her proposal, Xian already appeared anxious and unwilling. Conversely, Mingyan was much calmer than Xian. She kept her head lowered with her fringe, shielding her eyes. Chu Lian couldn't tell what she was thinking. Out of the corner of her eye, Mingyan cast a glance in Xian's direction and saw Xian's silent state. Since Xian was refraining from expressing her emotions aloud, Mingyan also didn't speak up. Chu Lian frowned when her two maidservants refused to speak. She continued explaining, "The two of you are my first-class personal handmaids, so I can't bear to send you off to someone else just like that. If one of you is willing to stay behind, when old Duke Zheng gets better, I'll still send someone to bring you home. Of course, if both of you are not willing to stay back, I won't force it. There are always plenty of other solutions we can think of." Chu Lian didn't like to force others at all. If none of the handmaids wanted to stay back, she wouldn't force the issue. She could just give out a few more secret recipes to settle the matter. However, staying behind to take care of old Duke Zheng was a rare opportunity for Xian and Mingyan. The two of them weren't stupid. They most likely realized that there were many benefits for them in this arrangement. Chapter 229. A Test. 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Matriarchy hadn't expected such a solution from Chu Lian. Her smile was full of hidden meaning as she also looked at Xian and Mingyan. After hearing Chu Lian's additional explanation, Xian had obviously relaxed, but Mingyan suddenly tensed. Chu Lian continued staring at the two handmaids. There was no small amount of pressure on them, facing down those piercing eyes. Xian and Mingyan's hearts were beating like drums. "Tell me honestly what you think about this. No matter what your choice is, I won't blame you." In an instant, Xian took in a deep breath and found the courage to look up. In a trembling voice, she said, "Third young madam, this servant doesn't want to stay behind. This servant only wants to serve by your side." Chu Lian was only startled for a moment. She smiled. "Then just stay by my side. Mingyan, what about you?" Chu Lian's answer lifted the great burden in Xian's heart. She looked at her master with slightly misty eyes before moving to one side. When Mingyan heard Xian's response, she clearly became even more nervous. After a fierce battle with herself, Mingyan still chose the path that was the most beneficial to herself. She looked up into Chu Lian's eyes and said, "Third young madam, this servant is willing to stay behind to look after old Duke Zheng." Mingyan had a pair of large eyes with double eyelids. Compared to Fu Yin's liveliness, she was much more taciturn. The original novel hadn't described Mingyan much. Chu Lian also hadn't noticed any shortcomings in her personality after observing her for a few days. However, as she was someone serving her so closely, Chu Lian would always find a way to test her personality. Today's problem was one such chance. Unfortunately, Mingyan had clearly disappointed her. However, this was her own choice, so Chu Lian wasn't going to blame her. Chu Lian's expression didn't reveal any trace of her inner thoughts. She smiled sweetly and said, "All right, then you'll stay and take care of old Duke Zheng. Since you're my handmaid, don't disgrace my name. Don't be stingy with the secret recipes you've learned from me, and use them generously for old Duke Zheng's meals. As for the rest of the arrangements, leave it to me and grandmother." Mingyan hadn't expected Chu Lian to have agreed so quickly. Her sudden happiness showed on her face. She secretly glanced at Chu Lian before looking carefully at Matriarch He. It was only after observing their expressions that Mingyan finally relaxed. She began to look forward to her new life in the Zheng estate. In the end, as smart as Mingyan was, she was only a young maidservant who hadn't seen much of the world. As ambitious as she might be, there was a limit to her vision. Since they had already finished their discussion and there wasn't any need for the other ideas she had prepared, Chu Lian instructed Mingyan on a few other things before helping Matriarchy out of the room. Old Duchess Zheng hadn't thought that a simple handmaid serving Chu Lian could know so many secret recipes. She was full of shock and surprise, as well as disbelief. A single secret recipe was already rare enough. Even if Chu Lian could cook well, she couldn't possibly be so generous as to teach all of her recipes to her handmaids. Taking in their disbelief, Chu Lian smiled and asked someone to prepare some ingredients. She then told Mingyan to show off her skills for the old duchess. Mingyan prepared some dragonbeard noodles. Rolling out the dough and cooking the noodles were not skills that normal people would know. It wasn't until the finished dish was placed before old Duchess Zheng that she finally believed that Chu Lian's handmaid was actually a skilled cook. Since she had proven her skill, Mingyan was left behind to take care of old Duke Zheng's meals. Old Duchess Zheng also knew that this was Matriarchy's largest concession to her request, so she personally escorted matriarch He and Chu Lian all the way to the outer court together with her daughter-in-law. Just as they were preparing to board their carriage, Heir Zheng rushed over. Heir Zheng was young and good at flattery. The moment he arrived, he greeted matriarch He and thanked Chu Lian for the feast the other day. Finally, he asked about the opening of Gillen restaurant. Chu Lian was a little surprised. Heir Zheng, how did you know that I'm about to open up a restaurant? Heir Zheng grinned. I heard brother He talking about it a few days ago. When the time comes, please don't forget to send me an invite. Honored Lady Jeannie. Of course. So that was what had happened. Chu Lian smiled. Heir Zheng was so straightforward that it was hard to be annoyed by him. After exchanging some pleasantries, Chu Lian followed matriarch He back to the Jing'an estate. After he watched House Jing'an's carriage leaving the Zheng estate, Heir Zheng turned to his grandmother and mother curiously. I heard that honored Lady Jeannie left her handmaid behind in our estate. What happened? When Duchess Zheng heard his question, she glared at him. You keep playing around and skiving off on your work just to pry into small matters like this? Why do you want to know all these things? Heir Zheng had always had a sweet tongue around others, especially senior members like his mother and grandmother. He hugged Duchess Zheng's arm. Mother, like you said, it's just a small matter. Since it's something small, just tell me, then I won't have to go and ask other people. Duchess Zheng only had one son, so she normally pampered him a lot. She looked at her son helplessly before poking him in the forehead. The handmaid that honored Lady Jeannie left behind is good at cooking. She's here to take care of your grandfather, so don't go around making trouble for her. Heir Zheng was surprised by this answer. Good at cooking? Then how is she compared to honored Lady Jeannie? Old Duchess Zheng glared at her grandson. How could she be compared to honored Lady Jeannie? She was taught by the honored lady herself. Didn't you say that you've tasted the honored lady's skills? If you try that handmaid's cooking in the future, then you'll know for yourself. When Heir Zheng heard this, he couldn't help but grow excited. With the meal he'd had back at the Jing'an estate, it was no surprise that he had some high expectations. It was already late afternoon by the time matriarch He and Chu Lian finally returned to the Jing'an estate. Chu Lian escorted matriarch He back to Qingxi Hall first. Right before she left, matriarch He sent all the servants out of the room. She held Chu Lian's hand and spoke intimately with her. You silly child. How could you send your handmaid off just like that? Now there's one less person serving you. How about having grandmother's Muxiang serve you? TL note. Mingyan was able to prove herself to old Duchess Zheng because dragon beard noodles aren't easy to make. Here's a video of someone making dragon beard noodles https://u2 b/dgrp7fvb2hg t equals 156 dragon beard noodles. On a side note, the method of making those noodles is similar to dragon's beard candy, which is one of my favorite snacks. I just bought some on my holiday too. 3 fine cotton candy strands wrapped around ground peanut stuffing. Yummy, dragon's beard candy. Chapter 230. Filled with their own thoughts. 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Muxiang was one of matriarch He's most trusted handmaids. How could Chu Lian accept her offer? She shook her head. Her bright eyes glimmered, full of spirit and affection. Grandmother, I'm not lacking for help. Furthermore, I'm the only one they have to serve in Songtao Court since my husband isn't around. There's no need to have so many servants just for me alone. Before Sanlang went off to the northern border, he even sent over Wenqing, Wanlan, and even senior servant Zheng for me. Even if Mingyan is going away, Wenqing can just take her place. After some thought, matriarch He came to the same conclusion. Chu Lian did have more than enough people to serve her since Wenqing and Wanlan had been added in. Since that was the case, she dropped the issue. All right, since you have enough people on your side, grandmother won't give Muxiang to you then. You did very well today. Even if that Mingyan decides to come back later on, think of a way to dismiss her from her service anyway. At least that other girl Xian seems to be more grateful. Matriarch He completely exposed Chu Lian's intentions in offering that choice to her handmaids. Chu Lian smiled sweetly. Grandmother's eyes are as sharp as ever. Upon seeing her sweet smile, matriarch He reached out to poke her the forehead. I wasn't aware you were so good at reading people. That's good. These handmaids are meant to be our trusted servants. We can't keep those who harbor straying thoughts by our sides." Chu Lian nodded in agreement. After they finished their conversation, Chu Lian returned to Songtao Court with Xian in tow. Xian felt a sense of pride welling up in her as she followed behind Chu Lian. Third young madam really trusted her now. When they returned to Songtao Court, in just a short moment's time, the news that Mingyan had stayed behind to take care of old Duke Zheng had spread. All the maidservants in the courtyard had uncertain expressions on their faces as all sorts of thoughts ran through their heads. Chu Lian handed down some orders to senior servant Gue and Xian before heading into her bedroom for some rest. Mingyan wasn't here anymore, so there was an empty position of a first-ranked handmaid to fill. After senior servant Gue and senior servant Zhong discussed the matter, they let Wenqing take up Mingyan's place. Her new responsibility was to take over Mingyan's work. Wenqing and Wanlan had been second-class maidservants. Now that Wenqing had been promoted to a first-class personal handmaid, senior servant Gue promoted a few more third-class maidservants to second-class to fill the gap. In the end, even the little menial servant girl who had been in charge of sweeping the courtyard, Baicha, had been promoted to third class by this ripple effect. Baicha hadn't thought she'd ever get such an unexpected windfall. The moment it was announced, she looked like she was going to cry tears of joy right then and there, but was ultimately persuaded not to. Now that the ranks of the courtyard had been settled, senior servant Gue dismissed everyone with a wave of her hand, and they all returned to their duties. Chu Lian's handmaids usually took turns in shifts. Xian and Fu Yin were originally paired together while Mingyan and Jingyan took the other pair. However, now that Mingyan had been left in the Zheng estate and Xian had just come back from serving Chu Lian, today's shift was taken up by Fu Yin and Jingyan. It was in the middle of the afternoon, and it wasn't time for afternoon tea yet, so most of the servants in Songtao Court were resting in their own rooms. Chu Lian was also having a nice nap in her own room. Senior servants Gue and Zhong brought Wenqing and Wanlan over to Xian's room with the intent of asking about the details of what had happened at the Zheng estate. In a small room off to the side of Chu Lian's bedroom, Fu Yin and Jingyan were sitting on standby while drinking tea and eating some snacks. Jingyan sipped a mouthful of sencha before sighing in a brooding manner. Mingyan's so lucky. She and Mingyan had both been sent to Chu Lian to serve as part of the dowry rite before the wedding. The two girls weren't family servants and had been bought from an outside slave trader. Chu Lian's stepmother had bought her a pair of outsiders. On initial glance, it was a kindness, but it was actually the reverse. Why would Chu Lian's stepmother be so nice as to give her valuable servants from the Ying family's pool? Servants who would be loyal to the Chu family as well as already educated on noble family customs and manners? She wasn't. Hence, Chu Lian ended up with Mingyan and Jingyan as part of her dowry. Fu Yin shot a glance at Jingyan. It's all up to luck for these kinds of things. We didn't know there would be such a great chance for us before third young madam left for the Zheng estate. That's true. If she had known earlier, she would have fought to be one of the servants accompanying third young madam today. Jingyan pressed her lips together in frustration. If she had taken Mingyan's place and followed third young madam out today, she would have been the one left behind. This was House Zheng they were talking about. Furthermore, she would have been put in charge of old Duke Zheng's meals. She knew how to cook all the same dishes that Mingyan knew too. Setting aside how rich House Zheng was, old Duke Zheng was someone that even the emperor respected. If she served him well and received the old duke's favor, she might even be adopted as his daughter. And even if she had to return to the Jing'an estate, she would have a higher status. She wouldn't just be a simple maidservant like Xian and Fu Yin. Other than that, House Zheng only had a single son for 3 generations. This son was the current heir Zheng, who also just happened to be in the prime of his life. A ripe time for marriage. Heir Zheng was currently studying in the Imperial College. He had a carefree and elegant bearing. The last time he had come to the Jing'an estate as a guest, he hadn't entered the inner court. Otherwise, she would have definitely found a chance to peek at him. Fu Yin sent a disdainful look at Jingyan. She was looking down on her for being short-sighted. It couldn't be helped since she was bought from outside. Just a little bit of wealth had completely mesmerized her. She wasn't fit to carry heavier responsibilities at all. What a waste of third young madam's guidance. Due to Jingyan's depression, She couldn't even bear to continue eating her snacks. SH sounded just as down as she looked. Fuyin, don't you want to go to the Zheng estate too? Fuyin tossed the remaining fried fish skin and peanuts she was holding back into the porcelain dish on the table. She dusted off her hands and stood up. I don't want to. I've been serving by third young madam's side since I was little. Who would bother with that little bit of credit from serving old Duke Zheng? Only you girls who came later would be so short-sighted. Then, she turned around and went back to the outer chamber of Chu Lian's room to wait for her master's orders. Chapter 231. Filled with their own thoughts, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Jingyan hadn't expected Fuyin to speak like that. It lit a fuse in her, making her grit her teeth in frustration as she pointed a trembling finger at Fuyin's departing back. However, she didn't dare to scold Fuyin either. There were quite a few other maidservants outside. After all, in the end, Jingyan could only scold Fuyin in her mind for being a fake. Fuyin was clearly dead envious on the inside, but on the surface, she still acted like she could care less. What a fraud. What could they gain from staying here in the inner court of the Jingyan estate? Their young master was far off at the borders, and the main branch of this family wasn't close to theirs either. The young master of the second branch only came back to the estate once or twice a month, so they didn't even have the chance to get close to him. Later on, when they came of suitable age, if third young madam was happy with their service, she would bestow them to a steward of the estate. If she wasn't happy, then she might even marry them off to some menial manservant to toil away for the rest of their days in poverty. Mingyan was so lucky to have met such a good chance. Even if she couldn't get into Zheng's bed, she might be able to get married to a minor official instead and become an official's legitimate wife. As for her, she could only stay by third young madam's side, toiling away her days in this Songtao court. What kind of future could she have? Mingyan's sudden departure had caused all sorts of hidden thoughts to surface in Jingyan's mind. Meanwhile, as Fuyin continued walking towards the parlor, she kept up her calm exterior despite no longer being in front of Jingyan. But in reality, how could she not be boiling with jealousy of Mingyan? However, there were other thoughts in her mind that kept her more patient than Jingyan. When she thought of He Changdi's outstanding figure and his handsome looks, as well as that strangely attractive cold demeanor and somber air of his, Fuyin was filled with excitement. She was going to wait, no matter how many years it took. She was going to wait until the day that third young master returned. With that letter in her hands, she was certain that she would be able to get third young master's favor. Meanwhile, Chu Lian was lying in her soft bed, covered in a fragrant, light blanket. She was deep in a comforting slumber, without any mind to care about what the maidservants in her courtyard were thinking about. In the following days, Chu Lian was kept busy with the opening of Gillen Restaurant. Time flew by in the blink of an eye, and before they knew it, there was only one day left before the 1st of September, the day of Gillen Restaurant's reopening. Mingyan had already been left in the Zheng estate to take care of old Duke Zheng's meals for about 6 days. After eating the delicious food that Mingyan had personally cooked, old Duke Zheng's spirit was back. In just a few days, he had already recovered to his usual state of health. By the 4th day, he was already able to get out of bed and move around. When it came to the 6th day, he could get up in the morning to practice the 5 animal exercises of Qigong. On this day, Zheng had come over to his grandfather's courtyard early in the morning. Old Duke Zheng had just changed into a short-sleeved tunic and was about to do some morning exercise when he saw that his grandson had come to visit him. He cheerfully extended an invitation to him and said, "Tianqing, come and practice some techniques with me." Upon receiving his grandfather's invitation, Zheng grinned widely, showing off his teeth. He immediately took off his outer robe and tossed it to his manservant. Then, he strode over to his grandfather's side and started practicing some morning exercises with old Duke Zheng. "You brat, why have you come over to grandfather's place so early in the morning? Are you here to steal a free meal?" Old Duke Zheng harumphed. Zheng was a talkative one. Grandfather understands grandson the most. But grandson isn't here just to fulfill some simple appetite today. "Oh, what's the matter? Tell me." Old Duke Zheng was full of energy. His punches were brimming with power. There was no trace of the man who had been on his deathbed just 6 days ago after almost starving to death. The power of gourmet food was really quite miraculous. House Jing'an's third young madam, otherwise known as Honored Lady Jeannie, is about to open up a restaurant tomorrow. If grandfather would like to go and take a look, grandson happens to have 2 invites here. Honored Lady Jeannie is that girl who came to our estate with matriarch he the other day? Indeed she is. That favored maidservant you have here was left behind by Honored Lady Jeannie. That does sound interesting. Leave one invite for grandfather then. Heir Zheng was so happy that even his eyebrows were beaming. After grandfather and grandson finished an hour of exercise together and took a shower, a senior servant entered the room to inform them that breakfast was ready. Old Duke Zheng brought his grandson to the parlor, where the table had been laid out with a variety of dishes. There were steamed rice cakes, flour rolls, steamed dumplings, fried breadsticks, and also some steaming hot pork porridge. They could smell the tempting aroma of the food even from the entrance of the parlor. The 2 men were already starving, so they quickly walked right in and sat at the table. As old Duke Zheng looked over the table laden with breakfast foods he had never seen before, a passionate fire seemed to be burning in his eyes. He shot a look at Ming Yin, who was waiting by his side. Ming Yin, quick, tell me what all these are. After old Duke Zheng spoke up, Heir Zheng turned to look at Ming Yin, who was standing by the table. When Ming Yin caught sight of Heir Zheng's gaze from the corner of her eyes, a faint blush covered her cheeks. However, she still managed to say, replying to old Duke Zheng and Heir Zheng, the plate over on that end contains a dish called double golden spears. It's crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. Ming Yin's gentle voice resounded within the parlor, but as Heir Zheng continued listening, he sensed something wrong. Although this girl was introducing the dishes properly, there wasn't any mention of Honored Lady Jeannie in her descriptions. By excluding her, Ming Yin was trying to imply that she had been the one to invent all these dishes. How was that possible? Heir Zheng's brows furrowed together as he took another look at Ming Yin. This time, Ming Yin also turned to meet his gaze. Her eyes were flush with desire, like a soft autumn wind. Heir Zheng stiffened and quickly turned his gaze away. Of course, all these little interactions had fallen into old Duke Zheng's sharp eyes. TL note: the morning exercises that old Duke Zheng is practicing are the 5 animal exercises of Qigong, based on the tiger, deer, bear, monkey, and crane. https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/5_animals #5animal exercise. Qigong. There are all sorts of steamed rice cakes, and the author didn't specify which type they're eating. So I picked one that's normally eaten as breakfast. Steamed rice cakes. Flour rolls make an appearance again. Flour rolls, steamed dumplings, Chinese fried breadsticks, also known as youtiao, are one of my favorite breakfast foods. They taste amazing when dipped in some warm soy milk. Fried breadsticks, aka youtiao, another great and healthy breakfast food, usually topped with slices of youtiao. 3 pork porridge with century egg. Chapter 232. Promotion 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. There was an old senior servant standing behind old Duke Zheng who served old Duchess Zheng. She also had the wisdom and sharp eyesight that came with age. Heir Zheng had recently started to come to old Duke Zheng's courtyard for breakfast more often. In the past few days, this maidservant that Honored Lady Jeannie had left behind had always quietly retreated back into the outer chamber of the parlor after bringing the food in. She would wait for old Duke Zheng's summons before coming back in. However, ever since Heir Zheng had started coming over for breakfast, this maidservant began to stay by the table instead of leaving after laying out the dishes. Once the heir entered the room, her eyes would be stuck onto him, as if no one else existed. Her desires were so obvious that the old senior servant felt the urge to snort. The old senior servant had also tried placing her own subordinates by Ming Yin's side to learn from her cooking these past few days, thinking that Ming Yin wouldn't notice. However, Ming Yin was still rather careful. When cooking, she actually sent everyone else out of the kitchen and even locked the door. She would rather cook everything herself and guard every single secret recipe than to let others steal her secrets. When old Duke Zheng finished listening to Mingyin's explanations, he waved her away. "You're dismissed." Mingyin was caught off guard by the sudden change. In a dazed manner, she said, "How about letting this servant serve your grace at the table? In the Jing'an estate, honored lady likes this servant's service the most." The old senior servant sneered. So she finally remembered honored Lady Jeannie. Why hadn't she mentioned honored Lady Jeannie at all when she was explaining those dishes? Old Duke Zheng suddenly looked at Mingyin with a frown. His eagle eyes carried an edge that stripped away all pretenses from their target. Mingyin couldn't hold back the urge to tremble with fear and quickly retreated with her head down. Old Duke Zheng cast a glance at Mingyin's back. What was that young lady thinking, sending her least loyal maidservant to him? Humph. Was she treating him like a test? Was that young lady satisfied with this result? When old Duke Zheng thought back to those words that Chu Lian had spoken to lure him out of his coma, his interest in her grew more and more. It seemed like he really had to go and see for himself what skills that young lady had in store. By the time both grandfather and grandson had finished their meal and allowed the servants to clear the table, the younger Duke Zheng had arrived. When Duke Zheng saw that his son was at his father's place again, his brows furrowed together. "What time is it already? Why aren't you going over to the Imperial College yet? Your grandfather has just recovered. In the future, you're not allowed to come over in the morning and disturb your grandfather." Zheng pouted and ran off in the blink of an eye. House Zheng had been succeeded by only sons for 3 generations. Their family rules were actually very strict. Although Zheng was pampered by his family, Duke Zheng was a strict parent. Case in point, Zheng was already 17 this year, but the servants in his courtyard were all male. He didn't have a single maidservant for his nightly needs, and was a genuine virgin. Duke Zheng had already noticed that the maidservant honored Lady Jeannie had left behind to cook old Duke Zheng's meals had impure motives, so how could he possibly give her a chance to get close to his son? Old Duke Zheng glanced at his son and pointed at the seat next to him. "You've come. Sit down. How's that matter I entrusted to you?" Duke Zheng took up a teacup and sipped some tea. Then, he nodded once and said, "I've already completed the tasks you've entrusted to me." Old Duke Zheng leaned against the back of his chair and played with a pair of walnuts in his hands. He closed his eyes, appearing quite fatigued. TL note: you didn't read wrongly. Old Duke is playing with walnuts, actual walnuts. So walnuts have apparently been a big thing in China since the ancient times and have been making a comeback recently. They're seen as a symbol of status and are a popular gift amongst the rich and elite. The best of walnuts have to be large and as symmetrical as possible with lots of ridges. I found an interesting news article about walnut farmers, https://www.thestar.com my/business/news/2014/10/14/money grows on trees with great walnuts of China/ and this is what they look like. Fancy walnuts. Chapter 233. Promotion 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Duke paused for a moment before saying, "Father, why did you suddenly think of the He family's third son? Even if mother and matriarchy are old friends, our houses have always maintained a distance. If father wants to repay honored Lady Jeannie's favor, then there are still plenty of other opportunities to do so." Old Duke Zheng shook his head. "It's a simple thing that doesn't require any effort from me. Just let that girl reap some benefit from this. Don't worry, father won't interfere in any more of House Jing'an's matters." After hearing such a promise from his father, Duke Zheng finally relaxed. Although his father had a distinguished reputation, he had already retired from the court. If he continued interfering in political matters, it would definitely draw protest from others. It was nightfall at the northern border of Liangzhou. The setting sun dyed the brown grasses of the plains golden. Although it was a bitterly poor place, the breathtaking scenery still brought joy to the residents' hearts. Not far off, this golden sunlight fell upon 2 men, drawing out long shadows on the dried grassy plains. A cold wind blew past, lifting up the ends of their robes. Seen from afar, it seemed as if they were standing on the edge of the horizon, taking step after step towards the fading light of hope. Liyue rushed forward to catch up to his master. He hadn't followed He Changdi when he had gone to join the northern border troops. Instead, he stayed behind in the city of Liangzhou to help his master handle other affairs. It was a rest day for the whole camp today, so Liyue brought some necessities for his master over to the entrance of the camp. It was only when he reached the camp that he discovered that his master had been promoted. He had gone from a lieutenant leading 100 men to a captain leading 500 men. Although it was only an additional 400 men under his command, it was still a huge transformation. A lieutenant could be called an officer, but could also be considered a slightly more elite soldier, as they only commanded a mere 100 men. However, captains were different. They carried a rank with them. Of course, He Changdi's position of commanding 500 infantry couldn't be compared to Captain Guo's position as a commander of cavalry. However, he was still considered a mid-ranked officer now, with an official 6th rank title. In peacetime, it would normally be hard for soldiers to get promoted to a higher rank. What's more, it was under the command of the strict general of the northern border, Duke Liu. Luck like this was extremely hard to come by. Liyue was immersed in joy. His master's efforts hadn't been wasted, and he could finally hold up House Jing'an's name as a military official family. If he reported this matter in his letters to home, matriarch, he would probably be overcome with joy. If third young master got promoted again, third young madam might even be able to become a titled noble wife. With these thoughts, the corners of Liyue's mouth unconsciously curled into a smile. However, when he saw that his master's expression was as cold as usual, he was a little confused. Liyue came over to his master's side. "Third young master, where are we going? It's a rare break for you. Aren't we going back to our courtyard in the city for a good rest?" He Changdi looked up at the old tent fluttering in the wind up ahead. He didn't reply Liyue, but asked instead, "Have you received any letters from the capital?" Liyue had been serving He Changdi for years. He understood that his master didn't want to answer his question, so he dropped the issue. "Judging by the time that has passed, we should be receiving letters from the capital in the next 2 days." He Changdi nodded and sunk back into his silence. As they continued on their way, he didn't say anything more. Liyue's thoughts were a jumbled mess as they tumbled around in his mind. What was wrong with his master? Hadn't he gotten promoted? Why was his expression still so dark, as if everyone owed him a few thousand taels? TL note: our cute author wrote this little scene at the bottom of the chapter. The chapters have also been getting a little shorter than usual. Author's note: mini theater. In a small dark room. He's Sanlang. "Let me out, let me out." Snow Mountain Mists. Wielding a whip, "What are you shouting for?" He's Sanlang. "Snow Mountain Mists, if you don't let me out, I'm going to kill you. Don't you know I'm a Reincarnator?" Snow Mountain Mists. "What are you so anxious for? I'm your mother. I know everything. I've only kept you locked up for a few chapters, and you're already this impatient. How are you going to bear greater responsibilities in the future?" He's Sanlang, drawing his sword. "What greater responsibilities? My wife is about to run off with someone else. How are you going to make this up to me?" Snow Mountain Mists, carefully avoiding the sword. "Fine. I'm going to grant you some mercy and let you out to play for a while." Chapter 234. Ama 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. He Changdi turned his gaze towards the horizon. Though his footsteps remained steady, his thoughts had already drifted far away. Other than Duke Liu and himself, even Captain Guo didn't know the real reason for his sudden promotion. Even though he had been performing exceptionally in the army, he wasn't the only one. He wasn't as silly as to think that this was some special treatment gifted from the heavens because of his reincarnation. He knew clearly what the personality of Duke Liu, also known as Great General Qian, was like after living 2 lifetimes. Even if General Qian's very own son came to this army, then he would still have to start from the lowest rank amongst soldiers. Furthermore, the general's demands would be even stricter. Since that was the case for the general's own flesh and blood, then some stranger like him would never receive any preferential treatment. Getting to work under Captain Guo and rising to the post of lieutenant in such a short time was already quite the feat that was also due to a combination of his previous life's memories and the help of Prince Jean. He had been able to meet Great General Qian once more thanks to that grape wine Chu Lian had sent over. But although General Qian loved wine, he definitely wouldn't promote him based on that alone. Thus, when Captain Guo had informed him that he had been promoted to a captain of the infantry, even He Changdi himself had been surprised. At that moment, he had immediately requested to meet General Qian. General Qian wasn't someone who liked to hide things, so he immediately revealed that it was old Duke Zheng who had sent him a letter and requested for his promotion. Old Duke Zheng had been General Qian's teacher in the past. His teacher had sent him a letter all the way from the capital, just to tell him to give He Sanling a chance. How could he not accept his teacher's request and do this small favor for him? Furthermore, old Duke Zheng was the person that General Qian respected most in his life. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that if his own father gave an order, General Qian might not even listen. But if it were old Duke Zheng, then his words were like law. No matter what, General Qian would do his best to execute his orders. Old Duke Zheng rarely requested favors from others, too, so General Qian couldn't just ignore the request. However, He Changdi wasn't stupid. He wouldn't reject the promotion due to some misplaced sense of pride. As his rank grew higher, it meant that his starting point was placed even closer to his end goal, and he would be able to achieve his desires even faster. He just didn't want to be someone blissfully unaware. There was always a reason behind abnormal situations. Although his grandmother was close with old Duchess Zheng and they interacted often, that was only between the two old matriarchs. Their houses remained aloof to each other. In his past life, after House Jing'an had landed in such a sorry state, old Duke Zheng had never even said a single word of mercy in front of the emperor. Why would he send a letter to General Qian now to take special care of him? As much as He Changdi wanted to continue asking, he knew that he wouldn't be able to find anything out from General Qian. Firstly, without considering whether General Qian even knew about the details behind this request, he probably wouldn't be willing to divulge them to him. After He Changdi asked to be excused from General Qian's presence, he could only wait for Prince Jin's letters, or any letters from home, to give him some sort of an explanation. He Changdi hadn't received any letters from home for quite some time. He didn't even know if that wicked woman Chu Lian had been behaving properly in the estate. If she dared to make any inappropriate moves, then he would cast her off the moment he returned to the capital. As these messy thoughts brawled back and forth inside his head, he managed to walk a rather far distance. He Changdi remembered something from his previous life. A month after the autumn examinations, the Tuhan had suddenly begun to attack the northern border, the same northern border that had remained peaceful for 5 years before. General Qian had brought over his troops to suppress the invasion for 5 whole months before he succeeded in maintaining the peace. Back then, the northern border troops had suffered heavy casualties. Furthermore, it had been winter and a blizzard had sealed off the mountain area. Supplies had been cut off from Liangzhou, and over a fifth of the army had starved to death. It was only after the snows had melted and spring had come, letting supplies flow into Liangzhou once again, that the situation had eased. They then destroyed the invading Tuhuns in one go. It was also in that war that the captain of the left-wing army under General Qian's command had achieved much merit and was promoted to General Chongping. This captain-turned-general had even been given a noble title. He Changdi's eyes narrowed and a bright glint flashed from within his pupils. This time around, the wildlands where he'd met his end, his old place of exile, would become the same place he would start his journey from in his new life. Chapter 235. Amma, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. After walking for another hour, the run-down old tent in the horizon was finally right before them. This was a small hillock, and the old tent had been set up where the hillock blocked the wind. The broken parts of the tent had already been patched up by someone using dried grass. Not too far off from the tent was an area cordoned off by a line of short fences, corralling 2 thin-looking horses and a few old sheep. The bleating of the sheep was transmitted across the plains thanks to the blowing winds. By this time, the sky was already beginning to darken. However, there were no lights shining from the tent. As they stood outside, they could hear someone coughing and a woman speaking in a hoarse voice. He Changdi's heart had long frosted over in the bleak freezing winds of Liangzhou, but it seemed like the woman's rough voice had slowly warmed it up. His eyes seemed to carry more passion than usual as he stared at the tint, which had almost been swallowed in darkness. His deep gaze was currently filled with warmth. He stood outside the tent for who knows how long. Finally, the tent flaps lifted, and a middle-aged woman walked out. Darkness had already fallen. Clothed in some thick furs and fabric, the woman couldn't even see the newcomer's face. She could only vaguely make out a rough silhouette.
Amma.
Changdi mumbled from the corner of his mouth. The middle-aged woman had just come out to toss some water and wash some bowls. When she looked up only to see two dark shapes standing not too far away, she cried out sharply and fell to the ground. Changdi quickly went forward to help her up. Up close, the middle-aged woman could finally identify the silhouettes as two young Han. She immediately relaxed and tried speaking to them in the barbarian language. Changdi replied to her in the same language. He was so fluent that he sounded exactly like someone born to it. The middle-aged woman then happily welcomed Changdi and Laiyue into the tent to talk. The barbarians living out here in the borders of Liangzhou were always friendly and welcoming. They would treat those who could speak their language like their own family, with honesty and enthusiasm. This quality of theirs, whether in his past life or present one, had never changed. It was also due to this fact that they lacked caution against others, and in a few years would be completely decimated by the Tuhan. The middle-aged woman lifted up the tent flap, and a strange odor immediately filled Changdi and Laiyue's nostrils. This was due to the tent not being aired out for a long period of time, keeping all sorts of moldy, stale smells within. Laiyue couldn't resist the urge to pinch his nose. When he turned to look at his master, he found that Changdi's calm expression hadn't changed a single bit, as if he was already used to this nausea-inducing odor. When Laiyue saw his master's calm, he could only lower his hand and bear with the odor as much as he could. There were no lights in the tent, so it was even darker inside. Changdi turned around to give Laiyue an order. "Light a lantern." Laiyue felt his way to the short table placed in the middle of the tent before taking out an oil lantern from his bag and lighting it up. With the flickering light of the lantern, the dark insides of the tent were instantly filled with a yellow glow. Using that dim light, Changdi could finally see his surroundings clearly, including the face of the barbarian woman standing across from him. The barbarian woman's eyes had widened, and she was looking at that small oil lantern in disbelief. After staring in a daze for a moment, she quickly waved her hands and reached out to extinguish the lantern's flame. "Asai, there's no need to light a lantern. Lantern oil is very expensive," the barbarian woman said anxiously. Asai was a respectful term for esteemed gentleman in the barbarian language. The barbarians worked only by the natural light of the sun and slept when the sun set. They didn't have any money to spare for luxuries like lantern oil. To buy a lantern and the fuel needed for one, they would have to visit a Han family or go to the Tuan markets. Furthermore, a single bottle of lantern oil cost half a sheep. Most barbarians wouldn't be able to afford one. Lantern oil was an absolute luxury for them. TL note, the term the author used is Mandarin, the man people, or literally barbarian in modern Chinese. Author's note, apologies, dear readers. I was busy today, so I could only write so much. There'll be more tomorrow. Also, the barbarians and barbarian language mentioned in this story are all invented by me, so please don't take it for real. Chapter 236, Blank 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Changdi held the barbarian woman back and shook his head. Then, he began to explain something to her in the barbarian language. The barbarian woman shot a careful look at Changdi before agreeing not to extinguish the lantern with a worried heart. She anxiously stood up, intending to warm up some sheep milk for Changdi. This time, Changdi didn't stop her. It wasn't until the barbarian woman had left the tent that Changdi started to scrutinize the insides of this broken old tent. There was a blanket covered by a fur skin in a corner of the tent. Two young boys were sleeping on top of it, one older and one younger. The older one looked to be 17 or 18 at most. The younger was most likely not even older than 10. The two boys had pale faces and were both clearly sick. Other than that strong odor of mold in the tent, There was also the light scent of medicinal herbs. The younger child was still sleeping at this moment. However, the older one had been staring at Changdi with eyes full of caution ever since he had stepped foot into the tent. Changdi's usually icy expression suddenly turned into a smile. Coupled with the warm glow of the lantern, highlighting his handsome features, he seemed like a deity who had descended onto this mortal earth. The young man lying in bed seemed a little dazed from this sight. Murin. This young man seemed exactly the same as the first time they had met in his previous life. Even the caution in his eyes hadn't changed. However, in his past life, they had met in the lands of exile he had been sent to, whereas now they were meeting in this small, simple tent. In his past life, this young man had stood in front of him as a shield, but had been killed by the steel wielded by the guards supervising him. In this life, he had come to meet him 3 years early in order to protect him and his family. By the time Changdi led Liyue out of the tent, stars had filled up the night sky. Even Liyue, who didn't know the barbarian language, had found out that the barbarian woman was called Wulihan, while the 2 boys were called Murin and Narasong. The middle-aged Wulihan escorted Changdi far away from the tent, before watching as his back disappeared beyond the horizon of the plains. It was only then that she returned home. Liyue followed Changdi under the light of the stars. Although he was curious as to why his master wanted to help a widowed barbarian woman and her children, it seemed like his master had too many thoughts on his mind to pay attention to him. Their silence persisted until master and servant returned to the little courtyard they had bought in Liangzhou City. Liyue had been living in the little courtyard all this time, so it was kept very clean. Most of the things required for normal day-to-day living were also already present, so they could stay there immediately. Changdi had only returned for barely a moment when an average-looking man leaped into the courtyard and personally passed a blue cloth bag into Changdi's hands. Liyue's face was filled with joy. "Third young master, it's a package from the capital." As Changdi held the package, for some reason, there was a strange sense of expectation in his heart, but even he didn't know what he was expecting to see inside. Liyue followed closely behind his master, waiting for his master to open up the package so he could peek inside as well. If there was jerky inside from third young madam, then his master would definitely share some with him. However, who could have expected Sanlang to carry the package into his room, locking Liyue outside of the door? The moment Changdi entered his room, his long legs unconsciously walked faster in order to reach the table in record time. Next, he unwrapped the package at lightning speed. Changdi was stunned. He stared at the contents for more than a few seconds before he finally managed to react. A bad premonition rose in his heart. Once he recovered his senses, he pulled out everything inside. This package wasn't like the previous one. Not only was there not a single snack inside, there weren't even any carefully packed pieces of clothing within. When he opened the package, there were only a few winter tunics inside. Even though they were made of fine fabrics and looked luxurious, he couldn't wear this type of fabric and styles at the northern border. Changdi couldn't help but remember the last package from home he had received. The previous package had contained bruise balm, waterproof leather boots, comfortable inner clothes, short tunics for martial arts practice, and even wrist and shin guards. Although there were only a few of each item, they were all things he needed. Even those he hadn't thought of were there. Liyue had said that the wicked woman Chu Lian had prepared those for him. Having experienced that sort of care and consideration, Changdi felt an unexpected sense of disappointment after looking at the small package he had just received. Sanlang pressed his lips together and suppressed that strange feeling welling up within him. He reached out to move aside the clothing at the top of the package and took out the wooden box below containing letters from the capital. When he opened the wooden box, his hands were unconsciously trembling and his heart was filled with a sense of uncertainty. However, the moment he lifted the lid of the fragrant rosewood box, the first thing he saw was the giant leather envelope placed at the very bottom. That wicked woman. Had she drawn more letters for him? All she knew was how to skive. Sanlang was alone in the room now. If Liyue had been there, he would have definitely caught a shocking, faint smile on his master's face. Changdi pushed aside the letters on top and took the giant leather envelope out of the box. His slender fingers flipped it over, every movement carrying a sense of urgency. However, Upon removing the stack of paper, Changdi wordlessly stared at them for a good 10 whole seconds. His originally warm eyes frosted over with anger. Finally, his handsome face turned dark and gloomy at a speed that human eyes could barely see. However, with the addition of his thick beard, his expression seemed a little funny instead. After a few more seconds, he sandlang threw the stack of papers to the ground in a fit, and even stomped all over them. Those papers that had been tossed to the ground were actually all blank. Sandlang felt like his lungs were about to burst from anger. That wicked woman. How dare she? In order to deal with him, she had actually sent him blank pages. Sandlang hated that he couldn't just appear in front of Chu Lian and grab her, recklessly bully her for a bit, so that she would finally know her duties as a man's wife. The impatient, moody Sandlang paced about his room. If not for his extraordinary patience, this room would have already been destroyed to bits. Chapter 237. Blank 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Back at the Jing'an estate, Chu Lian was currently lying in bed in Songtao Court. She flipped over and sighed in relaxation. She had completely forgotten about the fact that she had sent Sandlang a bunch of blank pages. When the main steward had personally come over to ask for Songtao Court's portion of the letters for Sandlang, Chu Lian had asked if Changdi had sent any replies back. The steward had hemmed and hawed for a long time before revealing that the young master hadn't sent a reply. Chu Lian had rolled her eyes on the spot. She had then entered her study, folded up a few pieces of blank paper, and given them to the steward. An eye for an eye. Sandlang had to dream on if he thought she would send him letters when he hadn't replied to hers. Meanwhile, Sandlang didn't realize that it was his own fault that he had gotten a blank reply. Lai Wei was guarding his young master's door. He listened to the pacing footsteps of his young master and wondered as he pricked his ears, is third young master so happy that he got a letter from third young madam that he can't sleep? It wasn't until 15 minutes later that Changdi finally managed to calm his anger. He sat back at the table and tore the rest of his letters open. After reading through them, his brows started to furrow together. It hadn't been as peaceful as he thought back at the capital. That wicked woman Chu Lian alone had done quite a lot. She had actually gotten a title for herself, and had even been personally named by the emperor. She had gone to the palace's mid-autumn banquet with grandmother. Even old Duke Sheng's recovery had something to do with her. Furthermore, she was going to open a restaurant, and it was actually the one that grandmother had long given up on. For some reason, Changdi started to remember the joking words that Lai Wei had used earlier today. Third young master is rising up the ranks so quickly. Maybe third young master will become a general in a few more months and third young madam will become a titled noble wife. It was a matter of pride and glory for a husband to earn a noble title for his wife through his own hard work and achievements. However, that woman had somehow managed to earn a noble title for herself without him playing any part in it. He shouldn't even care, but for some reason, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dissatisfaction with himself. Sandlang swore in his heart that he definitely had to become a high-ranked official in the future. He was going to get a first-ranked noble title for her and beat that stupid honored lady name. He was going to let the whole world know that she was Sandlang's wife, and not some rubbish honored lady Jenny. Immersed in his rage, Sandlang didn't realize that his feelings about Chu Lian had changed from wanting to divorce her to working hard in order to get her a first-ranked noble title. Of all these letters, Prince Jin's letter contained the most details. After reading everything, Changdi eventually managed to restrain the tumultuous feelings in his heart and think. He finally realized why he had mysteriously gotten a promotion. After finding out that it was all thanks to Chu Lian, Changdi didn't even know how to name the emotions sitting inside his heart right now. All he knew was that the only thing he wanted to do now was to grab that wicked woman and sit her down before him, so he could question her on what she was trying to do. In the murky depths of his mind, something was slowly starting to change. Was she really trying to help him? Why? Wasn't Xiao Wujing the one she really liked? Changdi was completely confused and disconcerted. He took in a deep breath. By the time he managed to settle his thoughts, half of the night had already passed. He personally changed the room's candle and adjusted the wick before sitting back at the table and taking out a sheet of paper. Perhaps due to calming himself down earlier, his writing wasn't as wild and crazy like the scribblings on the last letter he had sent. This time, he set his brush to paper with firm and forceful strokes. It was only when the first light of dawn started creeping up from the east that he Sanlang laid down on his bed, exhausted. There were 3 envelopes on the table. The one on the bottom was the fattest and probably contained about 7 or 8 pieces of paper inside. On the outside of the envelope were the words, "To my dear wife, Madam Chu." In the blink of an eye, it was already the 1st of September. It was already deep autumn. The weather was also starting to cool down, especially in the early morning and night. The best thing to do during this kind of weather was to stay in bed all day. It wasn't too cold or too hot. There was a slight warmth encasing the room, making it very comfortable. Chu Lian was wrapped up in a soft brocade blanket, half of her porcelain white face and flushed red cheeks peeking above the hem of the blanket. Her breaths were long and even, indicating that she was in deep slumber. When senior servant Gue and Shi Yin entered the room, this was the scene that greeted them. The corners of senior servant Gue's eyes twitched. She personally drew aside the curtains of the bedchamber and sat by the bed. She gently shook Chu Lian twice. "Aya, my dear third young madam, look at how late it is. How do you still have the mood to sleep?" Chu Lian rubbed her sleep-laden eyes and asked in a careless manner, "What time is it?" Senior servant Gue's expression was about to turn dark. "Third young madam, it's already the time of the dragon." The time of the dragon? Then that was only about 7:30 in the morning in modern terms. Chu Lian shut her eyes, wanting to go back to sleep. TL note, the ancient Chinese kept time in 2-hour blocks, naming each block after an animal of the zodiac. While the dragon hour would sound better than time of the dragon, the term refers to a 2-hour block, so it's not entirely accurate. Whenever time is mentioned in the story, it's actually in the ancient Chinese time format. When it appears in narration, I try my best to translate it to a modern time. Original. Chu Lian went to Qingxi Hall at the time of the horse, between 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Translated, Chu Lian went to Qingxi Hall at 12 p.m. This makes it easier to read and understand for readers. However, whenever time is mentioned by the characters themselves, it would be weird if they used 12 p.m. or 7 a.m., so I kept it to the original time of the dragon. Luckily, Chu Lian actually converted the time back to modern hours for us in the original text. If these ancient hours appear again in speech, I'll likely make a TL note at the bottom. If you're interested in finding out more about this time system, here's the English Wikipedia article https://n wikipedia.org/wiki/Chinese_traditional_system #dual-hour/sure note. Earthly branches equals 12 zodiacs. Chapter 238. Opening 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. How could senior servant Gue let her continue sleeping? Perhaps if it was a normal day, then she would allow it as she usually did. Even the matriarch regularly doted on third young madam, exempting her from the sunrise morning call, so their young madam could sleep in a little bit longer. The servants of Songtao court were no better. They sympathized with their third young madam and always let her sleep as much as she wanted. However, today was different. It was the day of Gillen Restaurant's reopening, something that third young madam had been planning for quite a few months. The matriarch was also eager to see the results of her work. Third young madam, Gillen Restaurant is reopening today. You have to go over there yourself? Senior servant Liu from Qingxi Hall even sent someone over to ask after you just now. After hearing senior servant Gue's words, Chu Lian opened her eyes and sighed. She sat up and ordered Shi Yin to bring her clothes. While dressing herself, Chu Lian told them, "Momo, you don't have to be so worried. Even if I don't go there myself today, Gillen Restaurant will still do well." How could senior servant Gue believe that? As magnificent as Gillen Restaurant was after the renovation, even though it now looked just as good or even better than that Yueheng restaurant on Juke Avenue, she still didn't believe that Gillen Restaurant would be able to fill its tables with customers right after opening. After all, its location was less than ideal. surrounded by residential areas and on a deserted street to boot. Senior servant Gue thought third young madam was trying to placate her like she was a naive child. When Chu Lian noticed the doubt in senior servant Gue's eyes, a corner of her lips lifted helplessly. She decided to use the results of today to prove it to her instead. Xian picked out an apricot-colored dress with plum blossoms for Chu Lian. It wasn't too outstanding, but still seemed celebratory enough due to the red plum blossoms on the skirt. Although Chu Lian wouldn't be making a public appearance at the opening, she had to personally attend to the guests she had sent invitations to. There weren't many invites, only 10 in total. She had personally written all of them. After all those months of practice, her calligraphy was finally passable enough to show. All the effort she had put into her daily calligraphy practice had paid off. Although there were only a few invites, they had all been sent to the most distinguished guests. The Zheng estate and Prince Wei's estate had received 2 invites each. Lord Gu and the young Marquis Wei Yuan had also received 1 each. Of the remaining 4 invites, 2 of them had gone to the Yang estate, while the other 2 had been sent to her maiden house, the Ying estate. These were the distinguished guests that Chu Lian had invited today. Chu Lian got dressed and slowly enjoyed her breakfast without any sense of urgency. It was only after senior servant Gue's anxious urging that she finally went to Qingxi Hall. Today, it was Wenqing and Wenlan's turn to accompany Chu Lian. The other maidservants were to wait until it was close to noon before following the 2 senior servants over to Gillen Restaurant to serve their distinguished guests. Fuyin and Xian stood by one side and looked at Chu Lian's slender silhouette. Fuyin was completely dumbfounded. She clicked her tongue in admiration. Hey, why isn't our third young madam worried at all? Will that out-of-the-way restaurant really become a booming business? Xian glared at her, confidence written all over her face. Don't talk nonsense. I believe in third young madam. Fuyin was still filled with disdain in her mind. She was just speaking the truth. Why was Xian stopping her? She didn't know where Xian got that self-confidence of hers. In her heart, even a person as wise as the matriarch hadn't been able to save that lousy old restaurant. How could their third young madam be even smarter than the matriarch? In the courtyard of the main branch, Madame Zhou waved her hand to dismiss the stewards who had come over to give their daily reports. A maidservant passed over a fresh cup of tea to her. Madame Zhou took the teacup and carefully sipped at it, her lips slightly curved into a smile. If she remembered correctly, today was the day that her third sister-in-law was going to reopen Gillen Restaurant. Gillen Restaurant was one of the matriarch's businesses. She knew better than anyone else about the situation of that old restaurant. She admitted that her third sister-in-law's secret recipes were really quite delicious, but the restaurant's abysmal location couldn't be denied. It was too desolate an area to attract a crowd. No one would think to walk over there just for a meal. A dead district is a dead business. What more for a restaurant? Building up a name for the restaurant wasn't something that could be achieved in just 1 or 2 days. By the time that happened, it would be too late. In the end, all of Chu Lian's hard work would have gone to naught, only for her to benefit from it. When she thought of this, Madame Zhou felt especially pleased. Today, she was waiting to see Chu Lian's disgrace. Just as her thoughts were lifting her mood, she spotted He Changqi striding out from their bedroom. When she saw that he had taken special care in dressing up today, she frowned. Dalong, where are you going? He Changqi straightened his collar and ordered a maidservant to bring over his breakfast. He then sat at the table and picked up some chopsticks before explaining, third sister-in-law's restaurant is going to open today, so I'm going there to help her out. When Madame Zhou heard this, her eyes immediately widened. It's just a small restaurant. Why do you have to be there too? He Changqi frowned as he looked at her. Brother Go, Tianqing, and Marquis Wei Yuan are all going there to support the restaurant's opening. If I don't go, who's going to attend to the male guests? Madame Zhou stiffened, and she looked at her own husband in disbelief. Suddenly, her heart was wavering with uncertainty. She thought back to the day that her husband had brought his friends over for a meeting, and she had stolen Chu Lian's credit. Had they already known before that? When he recalled the events of that day, He Changqi lost all appetite. He set down his chopsticks and lifted the edge of his robe as he stood up. Right before he left, he shot a meaningful look at Madame Zhou. Finally, He walked right out of the courtyard without even a goodbye. Left alone in the parlor, sitting on a fragrant wood chair, Madame Zhou's face turned deathly pale. She wanted to call him back, make him turn around with a cry of Dalong. But the words stayed stuck in her throat, even long after her husband had already left. Chapter 239. Opening 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. At Yuehong Restaurant, a lively feast was currently underway in the restaurant. People were urging their friends to drink and creating a pleasant buzz of noise. Suddenly, they heard the sounds of a commotion coming from the street outside, followed by an uproar of voices. Everyone subconsciously exchanged looks before the person closest to the windows pushed open the window pane. The cacophony from outside poured into the room. "What a huge crowd on the streets," someone said. A large man with curly whiskers roared with laughter. "What's strange about that? There's usually a crowd on the streets." Suddenly, all the people in the main hall laughed in unison. The cheeks of the person who had first spoken up flushed red. No, it seems like there's something going on. Someone's splitting up the crowd and making way for someone else. Some of them are dressed in lion dance costumes." The people of the capital all held a curious heart, no matter their status or rank. Very quickly, there were people poking their heads out to find out what the buzz on the streets was about. What a grand-looking lion dance troupe. I've never seen 6 people dancing at once. Don't tell me they've also prepared music to go along with this performance? Is it really that grand? At this time, a young man dressed in blue walked in from the entrance. The moment he entered, he started shouting, "Quick, come with me to check out the performance. I just came over from Chongping Lane and that Grand Lion dance troupe is preparing for their performance over there." The crowd couldn't hold back their curiosity. Quite a few of them came out of the restaurant and onto the streets one after another. Dan Restaurant's Mr. Wong had still been settling some accounts at the counter of his restaurant. Following the increase in noise from outside, the originally full main hall of his restaurant suddenly emptied out. A few waiters hurriedly chased after the leaving customers to settle their bills. "What's going on?" The gray-haired Mr. Wong frowned as he asked one of his waiters. "Manager, will you allow this one to go out to check for you?" Mr. Wong waved his hand in permission. After a short moment, the waiter returned. Manager, there's something big going on outside. What kind of event is it?" The waiter gestured with his hands as he said, "There are 6 people dressed in lion dance costumes out there, with shining lion heads this big. They even have musicians and singers behind them, all wearing the same kind of clothes. And though they look very festive, no one knows what they're going to do. They're currently finishing preparations out on the streets. It looks like the performance is going to start in a while. Manager, do you want to go out and watch too? There are lots of people outside on the streets right now." The waiter was clearly excited, and it was written all over his face, too. Mr. Wong set down the abacus in his hands and strode over to watch together with the waiter. All the customers in the restaurant had been drawn away, so they couldn't do business anyway. Why not check out what was going on outside and find out who was trying to cause trouble? When it was finally 10 a.m., the lion dance troupe gathered on Juke Avenue right outside Yuehong Restaurant suddenly began shouting together. The golden lions behind them started dancing, and following that, the music troupe behind them began to play their instruments. With the lion dancers in front and the rousing music behind, everyone was captivated. After a few beats, some of the spectators who had an interest in music began to cry out in surprise. "What tune is this? Why is it so strange, yet so full of emotion?" Just as someone finished saying so, one of the musicians started singing in a rough, loud voice. "The great rivers all run to the east. The stars in the sky look up to the North Star." Right after the first line, the remaining 10 or more men in the troupe continued in a chorus, Hey, look up to the North Star, a cup of wine for our sworn brothers." The leading singer continued, "If I say march, we all march. Yours and mine are all shared between us." The low and fierce chorus line shouted, Hey, all shared between us, no retreat come floods or fire." Of all the people of the capital, no matter if they were nobles or commoners, this was the first time they had heard such a strange yet catchy song. These lyrics were like normal speech, and the tune was easy to follow. The wild and heroic music made people's hearts soar with excitement. The crowd on the streets started getting bigger and bigger as all of them tried to peek at what was going on. Someone at the front of the crowd shouted, "The lion dance troupe is moving. They're moving. Everybody make way. Make way." Amidst the bobbing heads of the crowd, someone asked, "What are they doing? Why is it so lively here?" "We don't know either. Look, the troupe is moving forward. Let's follow along and see." A middle-aged man interrupted their conversation and said, That troupe looks like it's heading to the stage northwest of here. Don't tell me that it was this group of people who built it. That wooden platform was just set up a few days ago." The lyrics to the Song of Heroes were simple, and there were only 2 parts to it, yet the melody was rousing and majestic. The singing troupe had only repeated the song twice, but the crowd following behind them had already learned how to sing along. The leader of the music troupe sung once again, "When I see injustice, I roar with anger. When it's time to act, I fight. I travel the world, doing as I like." Without waiting for the chorus from the troupe, the crowd had already started chanting, "Hey hey, hey hey yo hey hey, hey hey, hey hey yo hey hey." That strange melody and magnetic song suddenly spread through the entire street in an instant. The lyrics were so easy to remember that even the little children had learned them. They ran alongside the lion dance troupe, chanting along with the singers. With the lion dancers dancing and the troupe members singing, the wide Juke Avenue was actually filled to the point that even a pebble couldn't squeeze through. Look, the lion dance troupe is finally stopping. The lion dance troupe had indeed stopped before the wooden stage that had been built beforehand. Following that, they nimbly climbed up onto it, causing the crowd to gasp in admiration. The sounds of singing and drums suddenly disappeared. At the last moment when the singing and drums stopped, the raised lion head suddenly spit out a large red scroll. TL note, Song of Heroes, or How Han Gu, is an actual song from the drama Water Margin, which is based on a famous Chinese novel about 108 outlaws who formed a brotherhood of heroes. I translated the song lyrics with the help of this Quora answer, and it also gives a more in-depth explanation of the lyrics if you want to know more. https://www.quora.com/can someone provide an English version translation of the 90s Chinese song How Han Gu by Lu Huan. Try listening to the song yourself here. https://www.youtube.com/watch HL equals NGB greater than or less than equals SG and V equals H 47S 8ES5. Finally, here's a picture of what a lion dancer looks like while spitting out a scroll. Lion dancer, try reading the chapter again with this image and the song playing. 3. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.